Study get us going.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Oh,
No worries.
my,
Okay, you're good.
You're good.
I call to order the study session of October 28th, 2024 at 6:00 PM. All council members are here with the exception of Councilmember Elfers. Is there a motion to excuse his absence?
I make a motion to excuse Andy Elfers from the meeting.
Thank you, Councilmember Potato. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Councilmember Bowman. So the only item that we have on the agenda today
Hey,
is,
Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you
Sorry.
take a motion or vote on that?
oh, how do I say that?
All
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? It's a unanimous vote. Okay, now I can move on to regular business. The only item on the agenda is the 2024 Comprehensive Plan Update, elements 11 through 15.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. We'll turn it over to Senior Planner Ann Theodore.
Thank you. I just have a brief introduction and then we'll turn it over to our consultants to help us get going. So this is the second study session that the council has had on the comprehensive plan. So tonight we'll be discussing 3 additional elements of the comprehensive plan: the housing element, the environment element, and the historic cultural resources element. And first, we're going to review the housing element, and I want to remind the council that the housing element is something you've reviewed before. You've seen a lot of this material. If you'll recall, on July 8th at your study session, we brought in a number of housing strategies for you to look at, and you made decisions on those housing strategies, such as expanding the MFTE, allowing small apartments in medium density residential, allowing multiplexes on large single-family lots, and so on. So those strategies that you decided on July 8th have now gone back to the consultants and staff, and now we have integrated those into the comp plan as policies and code changes. So our consultants will be talking with you more about that tonight. And then second, we'll talk about the environment element, and a key change here, a really significant thing that we're proposing to change here is a change to this minimum stream buffers. And I just want to call that, we're making a number of other changes to comply with state requirements, but that's a significant change for Sumner, increasing the stream buffer width for certain types of streams in Sumner. And then last on our agenda is the historic and cultural resources element, and then the regulations that go along with that. And one of the key changes here is that we've modified throughout the historic resources element, we've modified language to remove a lot of the language that mandates certain actions by developers to provide more flexibility. And we're also adding a requirement that we never had before that requires developers to consult with the State Historic Preservation Office when they're doing work on sites that might have historic structures. So that's a quick introduction to what we're looking at tonight. And with that, I'd like to introduce our consultants. We have Stephanie Heinmark from Burke Consulting, and Lisa down on our screen down in the right-hand corner, Lisa Greeter from Burke Consulting. And we have Claire Hoffman from Parametrics, who's been helping us with our environmental element and our critical areas regulations. So I will turn it over to probably Stephanie first.
Hi, good evening, council members. It looks like I need share screen permissions for the slides.
And Stephanie, can you turn up your volume, please?
Yes. Give me 1 second. Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Okay, great. Looks like I can share my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and walk us through some slides on the key proposed changes to the elements in code, and then Claire's going to walk us through the critical areas ordinance, and I'll also go through the actual policy and code language from your packet as well, and we can pause throughout for some discussion. So the topics, as Anne mentioned, that we'll be covering today include housing and land use. That includes both the element and code, climate, environment, and critical areas, and then historic and cultural resources.
Excuse me, Stephanie, it's Ann.
Yes.
We're hearing kind of a loud whirring sound. I don't know how to describe it.
I think that might be traffic outside my window. Let me see if there's a way for me to, I know. Let me see if I can get the Zoom background noise setting on. Okay. Is that any better? I just turned up the noise removal.
Sounds good now.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So, can everybody see my screen okay? Looks like I can see it in your background. So housing and land use will go through the elements and the code changes associated with growth targets, changes to your residential land use designations, accessory dwelling units, the multifamily tax exemption in Town Center and East Sumner, anti-displacement provisions, supportive housing, and some other changes as well. And then we'll cover the new climate element, changes and the critical areas ordinance updates. And then we'll finish up with historic and cultural resources, both the element and the code changes. So starting with housing and land use. As Ann mentioned, housing capacity and affordability is really a big topic driving the plan update. And that's because the state has introduced some really substantial new requirements over the past couple of years. That includes House Bill 1220, which requires planning for and accommodating housing for all income bands and addressing displacement and racially disparate impacts. It also includes House Bill 1110, which requires allowing middle housing. And for Sumner, that means 2 units on every residential lot. So everywhere the city currently allows only single family housing, you now need to allow 2 units per lot. And then House Bill 1337, which requires more flexibility for accessory dwelling units, which includes allowing 2 accessory dwelling units per residential lot. And we'll go through the details of these in the next couple of slides. But starting with a high-level overview of the growth targets, the growth targets for the city from 2020 through 2044 include 1,985 housing units, 5,313 jobs, and 4,904 residents. And based on the analysis that we've done, the city is on track on its jobs target without making any land use changes. It's really the housing that requires some new policy development. And the Pierce County countywide planning policies has set those targets. And this time around, the city not only has to meet that overall 1,985 housing units, but also needs to think about meeting targets for each income band, which are covered at the bottom of the screen. So that 1,985 housing units is broken up into different income bands. And that was done through the Pierce County countywide planning policies. And you'll see that more than 60% of that target is units affordable to below 80% of the area median income. And that is based on analysis from Pierce County and the state. And it does take into account what's currently in Sumner and what the projected needs are for the future. And the state guidance essentially says higher density housing is likely to be more affordable to lower income bands. We know that some areas of the city might still need incentives to achieve this, so we're taking that into account in our analysis as well. Units in Town Center and East Sumner coming in at market rate don't tend to meet these affordability needs. So we're thinking about that as well. But the city essentially needs to show that you have enough land capacity for the right mix of housing types. And then you also need to show that you're removing barriers to actually developing them. The city is not required to build anything. It's really just setting the context in which developers can build the housing that's needed. So in terms of meeting those housing targets, we analyzed the current code and policies and unsurprisingly found that they would not achieve those capacity numbers by income band. And that's a scenario that a lot of cities in Washington are going through right now with this new requirement. We did a draft environmental impact statement that looked at that no action alternative, as well as 2 sets of policies that would achieve that capacity by income band. The Planning Commission made a recommendation on a preferred alternative, and staff presented that preferred alternative back in July to the City Council. And that is a hybrid of those 2 alternatives, and it does meet the capacity needs by income band. And the policies that are part of that those 2 units per residential lot, which is meeting the state requirement, allowing 2 ADUs per residential lot, also a state requirement, allowing up to 1 fourplex on large lots in the low density residential 8.5 and 12 designations, and large lots being those that are 1.5 times the minimum lot size. It also proposes increasing the maximum density in the medium density residential from 15 dwelling units per acre to 22. And we can show you some examples of what that looks like in a couple of slides. Also allowing multiplexes and small apartments up to 3 stories in the medium density and high density residential zones, changing the multifamily tax exemption in town center to be affordable only and expanding the East Sumner multifamily tax exemption, and then allowing bonus density for affordable housing on religious organization property. The city currently has a process for doing that for senior housing, and this would be kind of applying that same process to affordable housing on property owned by religious organizations. And that also does relate to a state requirement to allow bonuses for those types of developments.
Stephanie, we have a question if you could pause.
Sure.
So I was wondering if we don't have any developers that want to build to these specifications, are we like challenged or dinged for not reaching that goal? Because it's hard to, require a developer to, I would think, to build what
Yeah,
would help
oh,
us
sorry.
reach the goal. So I'm just wondering what your comment is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. The state does not expect the city to be able to fully realize these units. They recognize that the city is not in a position to build them or make any developers build them. It's just setting that context and making sure that there's enough capacity to build them in theory and kind of set the context in place in which developers could build them, and kind of create some incentives for doing so. I think Lisa might have something to add.
Just to add that all the counties and cities have to turn in a 5-year monitoring report. And the topics include housing and permitting, as well as vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas reductions. So if the city finds that there's continuing barriers to achieving housing goals, then it might choose at that 5-year time period to identify if there's other ways to achieve it. But Stephanie is absolutely correct that it is on the city to create the opportunity, and it's not the city's responsibility to actually build the units.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
What is the minimum lot size requirement? I mean, so I'm trying to figure out how many opportunities are actually in the city. I mean, there's some small lots. Are you saying that we need to allow 2 units per residential lot? I mean, what if your lot size is 5,000 square feet?
Yeah, and I'll let Stephanie elaborate on this, but you're right, we have a variety of lot sizes throughout the city,
Yeah.
some 6,000, 4,000 square feet, up to 12,000 square feet. So as part of the analysis that our consultants did, they looked at what actually does that translate to realistically,
Right.
and all of that information was used to help us figure out what is a combined strategy. What can we grab over here with 2 dwelling units per lot, and then some increased opportunities for multiplexes. But every lot is going to still be subject to the same setbacks, and for example, and lot coverage percentages and so on. So it's not as though every lot in Sumner is going to realize those 2 dwelling units per acre. So Stephanie, maybe you can talk a little bit about what Burke found when you were looking at this.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The 2 dwelling units per residential lot does apply regardless of the current lot size. But as Anne said, there are setback requirements and other things that would affect kind of the form of that building and its feasibility. In terms of what we found on the large lots question, so in low density residential 8.5 and 12, I believe we found about 60 lots that are more than 1.5 times the minimum lot size throughout the city, if that helps kind of give some context to that piece.
What's the minimum lot size?
Oh, in low density residential, 8,500 square feet, and then 12 would be 12,000. Is that correct, staff?
Correct.
So we have, it depends on the zone. I'll just elaborate a little bit on that, Stephanie. It depends on the minimum lot size depends on the zone. We have a 6,000 square foot or LDR 6.5, 6,000. I can't remember the acronym, sorry. Yeah, 6,000 square foot lots, so very small lots. And you'll see a lot of that downtown here on these older residential lots. And then as you get up a little further north into the newer neighborhoods, a lot of those have a minimum lot size of 8,500 square feet, and then we go all the way up to 12,000 square feet, which those are very large lots, and those tend to be in areas of natural resources. So they might be along Salmon Creek with a huge stream setback. So the intent there is to have more land that's open to pervious surfaces. But it does range across the city depending on what neighborhood you're in.
Thank you. I was just trying to visualize what the town could potentially end up looking like. And that's why I'm trying to understand the size of the lots,
Yep.
because there's some that are decent size, but they've got stuff on them, and there's others that are very small. And so on some of those smaller ones, am I, envisioning two tiny homes in the back? Am I envisioning another house in the back? Because I don't know what the setbacks are, right? Because why would I know? I don't know what the setbacks are. And at one point I thought there was a 0 lot line coming into town, so I don't know what those are.
And we do have some provisions in our code to allow 0 lot line setbacks where the homes are sharing a lot line and a wall, but they have their own yards around them, for example. So those setbacks are 0 in some cases, or 5 feet perhaps on the other side. So the setbacks vary, but the setbacks are not huge. They're fairly consistent throughout the zones, 5 feet on one side, 10 feet on another side for most of the single family lots. So if you can imagine, say those 6,000 square foot lots downtown, you might see an ADU developed there, or an attached ADU if the lot is small. As you get into some of the larger lots, you might actually see a larger ADU, or you might actually see some duplexes in the MDR zone, and also on the larger LDR, low density residential zones.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Ray.
And an ADU could be, like on a small lot, it might be a unit built over a garage. So you've got the street, the house may face the street, and back on the alley, you might have a garage with an accessory dwelling unit over top. So it can kind of fit into the character of the neighborhood. Really, the lot sizes over the last 25 years have gotten a lot smaller, just in general. 8,500, 12,000, those are really large, generous lots in terms of size these days. Much more typical is 4,000 and 5,000 square feet. And we do have a 0 lot line development. If you're familiar with Elm Street and 160th, on the northeast part of kind of downtown, there's a new 0 lot line development over there, where they're actually the townhouses that touch. They're actually on their own very small piece of land. That was something that Ann took through Planning Commission and Council a couple of years ago, and it was able to come to fruition. So we're pretty excited about that.
Okay. Did this change anything with pipe stems? Are they narrower now, or have they stayed the same?
We went through and made some changes to our pipe stem lot code as well a couple years ago.
If I understand your question, pipe stem lots are still required to meet the setbacks of the zone in which
There's
they
a bunch
are.
of little residentials that are all 60-foot frontage, and at one time I remember you couldn't put a pipe stem on that because it was too narrow. Does that change that? I
We
hate
did
getting in the weeds.
One of the things we did in that code update a couple years ago was we changed the access standards to allow narrower
Oh, okay.
drive aisles. So that opened up the possibility for some additional pipe stem development behind the narrower lots on front. And it also opened up some opportunities for even two neighbors to share, create a joint easement. So
Cause I know a bunch of narrow lots in town that at one time we weren't doing that, but.
it's still gonna
Okay.
be difficult for a lot of those narrow lots.
Yeah, pipe stem lot is a lot with subdivision design where you've got maybe an existing house and then you do a narrow driveway down past the house and you subdivide behind them. So you just have this narrow pipe stem or flag lot design.
Thank you.
Any more? I think we're good.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay. So just to summarize the changes by land use designation, in the low density residential, that's allowing those 2 units per lot, allowing those triplexes and fourplexes on large lots in LDR 8.5 and 12, and then allowing 2 accessory dwelling units per lot where single family is the primary unit. We're recommending keeping that to single family as the primary unit, and that is in line with the latest guidance from the state. So you wouldn't be able to build a duplex and 2 ADUs on a lot given the code that we have proposed currently. And then we have a couple of just examples on the screen of what a duplex and a fourplex might look like. Kind of similar form to a single family home, but the scale varies for the larger fourplexes. And then onto accessory dwelling units. Those changes that the state has made requiring more allowances for accessory dwelling units include 2 allowed per lot, and that's any combination of detached or attached. So you could do 2 attached, 2 detached, 1 of each. No owner occupancy requirements. You have to allow conversion of existing structures, so turning a garage into an accessory dwelling unit, for example. You have to reduce any height requirements or expand any height requirements to no shorter than 24 feet. So you can no longer have a height requirement of 18 feet or 20 feet. The maximum size limit is also now 1,000 square feet. The city also needs to look at its parking requirements near transit, making sure that they can also be sold as a condo unit, and revisiting design requirements to make sure they're not too strict given the new requirements from the state. And then we just have a couple examples of an attached and detached ADU and what those can look like. And then in the medium density and high density residential designations, again, the proposed change would be allowing up to 22 dwelling units per acre in the medium density, so up from 15, and then allowing multiplexes and small apartments up to 3 stories in both the medium density residential and the high density residential. And across the bottom, you can see some examples of what different densities can look like. So the 15 and 19, kind of similar in feel, and then the 26, a little bit taller, a little bit more dense. And so those 2 on the left would be permitted under the proposed code changes for the medium density residential. The one on the right would still be just a little bit too dense for the high density residential, which we're proposing keeping at its current maximum density of 25 dwelling units per acre. And then another proposed change is to prohibit new single family homes in the high density residential zone to maintain that capacity for higher densities, but current single family homes could remain. And then just a map for context, much of the city is designated for low density residential. So those are the areas in which duplexes would be allowed, and larger lots could do a triplex or fourplex. And then we've got the medium density residential, again, up to 22 dwelling units per acre, and the high density residential, both medium and high, proposed to allow up to small apartments up to 3 stories.
We have a question.
What is the purple zone?
Purple is the town center district.
Is it? Okay, that's what.
And then moving on to the multifamily tax exemption. So in town center, there is currently a multifamily tax exemption, or MFTE, for market rate development and affordable development. So any development can qualify for an 8-year exemption without any affordable units. And then if the project has 20% affordable units, they can qualify for a 12-year exemption. And you can see on the right the boundary of the town center multifamily tax exemption, and there's no proposed changes to that boundary. But we are proposing making the MFTE available for affordable projects only. And that is with the intent of encouraging more affordable units to be built. There's some guidance from the state out that recommends that if your goal is more affordability, then limiting it to affordable MFTE is a good strategy to try and accomplish that. And then we just have an example of one of the current projects that is coming through given the current code in the area. And then in East Sumner, there is currently a multifamily tax exemption that is affordable only. So just that 12-year multifamily tax exemption, which requires that 20% of the units in the development are designated affordable units. The red on the map is the current boundary of that target area. So the areas in which one might qualify for that exemption. And we are proposing expanding it to the full East Sumner neighborhood plan boundary, which is in the black line. And then on the bottom left is an example of a market rate project in East Sumner. And then another part of the due state requirements is to include policies that address displacement. And the proposed policies and regulations that we've covered so far do address this in part by expanding housing options, improving affordability, creating capacity for all income bands. But there is an additional measure proposed in the draft plan, which is new text and policy support in the comprehensive plan for a future manufactured home park overlay zone, which could protect about 260 low-income households. We are not proposing any code to go along with that at this time. It would be adopted in 2025, given more public engagement opportunities. But we are proposing a couple of tweaks to the code with the comprehensive plan update, which include allowing manufactured home parks in all residential zones as a conditional use permit. So the existing ones wouldn't be non-conforming. And then also removing the requirement for a manufactured home on a single family lot to be new, because that can be quite prohibitive in terms of cost. And then just on the right, you can see the 4 manufactured home parks that are currently in Sumner. Okay, and then moving on to supportive housing. The state limits the city's ability to restrict permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelters. Permanent supportive housing being kind of longer term housing for folks who may be in and out of homelessness. Transitional housing being shorter term, I believe less than 2 years. And then emergency housing being even shorter term than that, and shelters being quite temporary. So the proposed changes in line with the new state requirements include no longer requiring occupancy limits that are more restrictive than the fire code. So there's lower numbers in the current code, depending on the zone, that are more restrictive than the fire code. And the state is saying you can no longer do that, as well as no longer limiting the number of units per parcel for permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and emergency housing. But the zone would still control the number of units that could be built. You just can't say that as a permanent supportive housing project, you can no longer say you have to build fewer units as that housing type than any other housing type that could be built there. And then spacing requirements between facilities currently in the code. The city requires half-mile separation of each of these types. And now we're proposing limiting that to just 880 feet instead of a half-mile separation. And that's in line with the state's guidance as well. So essentially the state is saying that the city can no longer limit occupancy in the same way, limit number of units in the same way, or require separation as it currently does.
Okay, so I have a question on that. So again, I'm trying to draw a picture in my mind. So can you interpret it in layman's terms for me?
Wait, the concept of, I'm
Well,
sorry, I
just-
didn't understand.
Just this
The last-
paragraph, yeah, so no longer require occupancy limits more restrictive than the fire code. All right, so they gotta meet the
Yeah.
local fire code for the building. Is that what I'm assuming there?
Yeah.
Yes, we had, the council looked at, adopted regulations for permanent supportive housing, transitional
Right.
housing. Ryan, you took that through the council couple of
Yeah.
years ago. And it's, again, a requirement we have to meet from the state to accommodate these types of transitional housing.
Sure.
people who are at risk of homelessness. And in our code, we were pretty conservative.
Yeah, it was
We
25.
had like 1,000 feet separation between facilities and so on. And the state subsequently adopted regulations that, and Department of Commerce gave us guidance that said we can't have spacing of 1,000 feet between facilities. They should not be greater than 880 feet. And we had occupancy limits that varied by zone, but it was like no more than 10 occupants.
It was really low.
It was really low, and some of that was based on the housing count. that-
Yeah, homeless once a year count.
To kind of calibrate, we were trying to respond to the state, and we were trying to calibrate what the state wanted with what was appropriate for Sumner. So we had our code set up, and these are new requirements from the state. So occupancy, and it starts to get into fair housing issues when we start setting up occupancy, kind of arbitrary occupancy limits. So the state is telling us that we should not be more restrictive than what the building or the fire code says, based on the type of structure it is, and ingress and egress.
Yeah, and then for density, it falls back to our zone, instead of saying, oh, we're only gonna limit so many units per parcel that are this type of housing. Now, we have to look at our zones, and then for the spacing, as we already talked about, we have a much larger separation between these types of facilities in order to kind of avoid a concentration of them in one particular place. And the state's gone through in their wisdom and said, well, 880 feet, that's the most you can separate them. So we're addressing their desires.
So in another way, to sum this up in one sentence, our code was more restrictive than what state law currently allows. So we have to bring our code in line with the state law, which means loosening up a lot of the regulations that we put in place, or the guardrails that we put in place.
So transitional housing could be any kind of transitional housing, correct? Can you define transitional housing for me, could you please?
It's,
We have some definitions.
It's all right,
I
just,
think,
just,
yeah.
I mean,
Off topic.
it's housing that, as the name would imply, that you're moving from a homeless situation to a temporary set of housing in order to then, get services and get on your feet and move out of that housing. Whereas permanent supportive housing, as a contrast, is, you can be there permanently. Maybe you're disabled, or there's
so
some
this
other-
is all around homelessness, it's not about people in transitional drug houses, transitional,
Not typically, it's more housing related.
It's not a recovery residence.
Right,
or-
Yeah.
behavioral health.
Yeah,
medical
yeah, thanks for
facility.
asking that
Yeah, that's good.
clarification.
And then, of course, emergency housing, emergency shelters, that's kind of self-explanatory. That's very short term. That's maybe like a winter shelter that we need to get some folks off the street.
right,
kind of
And I might just add, these facilities are not like each other. So transitional housing could be a single-family home tucked into a neighborhood that might be available for people who are escaping domestic violence and are
so it is more than
a place to
homelessness.
live. Yeah, so it's really, it's not addressing rehabilitation, that kind of thing. It's more about housing
Okay,
for vulnerable
Got it.
populations.
okay, thank you.
A couple other updates in the land use element, and we'll look at these in line together in just a second. A new policy about considering impacts to tribal treaty rights in land use decisions, clarifying policies to implement the town center plan and the manufacturing industrial center goals. Some new policy aligning sub-area plans with the comprehensive plan. New policy around encouraging healthy communities, and that's something that's emphasized in the kind of regional plan, Vision 2050 by Puget Sound Regional Council, and the adopted Pierce County countywide planning policies. A new policy to plan for standards and programs to reduce wildfire risk, and then a new policy to support small scale agriculture and nonprofit community gardens. And those last two also relate to the climate element, which we'll cover a little bit later in the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and open the packet, and we can go through the element and code changes. Starting with land use, you'll see a little bit of new text in the introduction, just explaining the new targets from 2020 to 2044. Also adding some more text on the Sumner Pacific Manufacturing Industrial Center, which must plan for 20,000 jobs total to maintain its status. Based on our analysis, the city is in line to do that, so there were no policy changes recommended to achieve that. It's just giving that context. And then this first goal, we did a little bit of rewording just for clarity. Previously said provide for orderly development. We recommended providing for a variety of land uses in Sumner while preventing adverse impacts and ensuring consistent implementation of policies and regulations. So trying to get at the more specific intent of that goal. Some kind of text cleanup in 1.1.1, 1.2.1, and 1.3.1. Under 1.3.1, Lisa mentioned that 5-year progress report that the city needs to do on climate, housing, permitting. And so we recommended changing this policy to annually review regulations to periodically review them more in line with the 5-year progress report and giving the city a little more flexibility. And then we have a couple of policies on sub-area planning. So we've got 1.4, 1.4.1 talking about identifying planning sub-areas that warrant further study, the current planning sub-areas. And then 1.4.3 is saying that policies in those sub-area plans that have been pulled into the comprehensive plan will be updated automatically when you update the comprehensive plan. So the idea there is that the policies in the comprehensive plan will supersede that same policy in the sub-area plan if the text changes. So that the city doesn't have to go back into those sub-area plans and update them every time you update those policies in the comp plan. And then goal 2 is around potential impacts of tribal treaty rights. So considering those in land use decisions in 2.1, when notified by tribes of treaty rights in a particular location, incorporating ways to preserve and address those. And then ensuring the tribes are provided timely and sufficient opportunity to comment on significant development projects and land use decisions. And that's something the city already does through its environmental review process, but just adding that policy language to align. And then we just have a map, vicinity map included in the land use element. And then goal 3, there's some policies under here that were in the previous plan, but they've been reorganized a little bit under a new goal. So consistent with the Growth Management Act, designate an urban growth area within which urban growth must be encouraged and outside of which growth may occur only if it's not urban in nature. And then one new policy, 3.1, including sufficient areas to accommodate the city's projected growth and housing needs.
Excuse me, Stephanie.
Yes.
Council members, are you able to see the screen? Should that be a little larger? Would it help?
Well, it would, but I'm reading it on my computer.
Okay, okay, just making sure I see somebody
Thank you.
squinting a little
Yeah.
bit.
Oh, I'm
so-
having other issues.
I wasn't picking on you. Okay,
Thanks,
sorry,
Stan.
Stephanie, go ahead.
No problem. I just bumped it up a little bit, so hopefully that helps. Okay. So moving on to 4, that was an existing goal, but we suggested a policy within it around implementing the town center sub-area plan. Added a goal on the manufacturing industrial center, kind of a parallel goal and policy to the town center one. And then goal 6, encourage neighborhood development that supports healthy communities. As mentioned on the slides, Vision 2050, which is the Puget Sound Regional Council Plan, and Pierce County countywide planning policies talk a lot about healthy communities. And so that's where some of these recommendations came from. So there's a group of policies here around promoting land use planning that supports things like walkability, tree canopy, access to services, considering environmental health and other impacts of land use decisions on overburdened communities. And that term overburdened communities is a term used by the state and federal agencies that kind of covers environmental justice, so groups that have experienced disproportionate impacts. So for example, if there's a neighborhood that has more air quality impacts, that might be considered an overburdened community. And that overlaps with different demographics, such as minorities, lower income groups, tribal or indigenous populations, and others that might experience disproportionate environmental harms and risks. and encouraging the participation of overburdened communities in decision-making. And then some policies around landscape screening and trees, around noise and air pollutants, mitigating environmental health effects of climate change, engaging with the community on climate impacts and adaptation, supporting energy efficiency and upgrade programs that reduce health risks for vulnerable populations. And vulnerable populations is another term that comes up in a lot of the state guidance, and that is generally referring to groups that are more sensitive to extremes. So that would be more like children, older adults, people with pre-existing health conditions that might be more vulnerable
Do we have a
when events
question,
occur.
Stephanie?
Yes.
Hi, Stephanie. Jason, I'm the city administrator. Councilmember Elfers emailed me his comments since he couldn't be here tonight. So if it's all right with you, as we hit his comments, if I can just read them and then you guys can discuss whether or not you want to recommend changes or not. On 6.4, so currently it says mitigate the environmental health effects of climate change, and it goes on. He is requesting to add the word economically feasible, start that sentence with that. So as economically feasible, mitigate the environmental impacts. He's worried that the cost is very expensive and wants to leave room for the council to make this work in the budget.
I agree with that.
So do I.
If I could add, what I would suggest is wording that is where feasible. Economically feasible is one way of measuring feasibility. Just spatial requirements, community preferences, structural infrastructure issues. So would that be acceptable to the council? I think that would meet Mr. Elfer's intent.
I think it actually broadens it a little bit more, right? So
It would.
it could be anything, even if economically we could do it, if there was something else that makes it not feasible, we could still discuss that. So I could live with that. We're feasible.
So could I, looks like everyone else could, yes.
Okay,
We like
good.
it.
Thank you. That's it for that section, Stephanie.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. So we're talking about vulnerable populations, also some policies around mitigating wildfire risk, studying the potential impacts of a citywide tree retention program. So not requiring such a program, but studying what that might look like or accomplish. And then support small scale agricultural uses in residential developments and local community gardens sponsored by public agencies, nonprofits, and private development. And then onto goal 7, there's a little bit of cleanup in the text of the goal, but similar intent. Moving through to the residential protection section, a little bit of cleanup here, a little bit of clarity on what this designation is intending to accomplish and what kind of conditions it reflects. Under low, oh yes, go
Stephanie,
ahead.
sorry, it's Ann. Just so the council understands what we're talking about, these are the land use, you might already know this, but these are the land use designations in the comprehensive plan. So when you see that comprehensive plan map, it has the colors on it and the key, the legend, that's what we're talking about here. They're not so much policies, but they're you can adjust the wording of them as you might a policy. But these then direct the zoning districts that get adopted in the zoning code. So you'll see, for example, there's a district in the comprehensive plan called low density, but in the zoning code, there are different low density residential zones. So that's the function of this. This lives in the comprehensive plan to guide changes in the future to the zoning map. So just want to give you some context there. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to low density, again, a little bit of cleanup in here. I don't think there's anything substantial other than adding duplexes as a primary use in line with that requirement for 2 units allowed per residential lot.
Excuse me, Stephanie. I'd like
Yes.
to also add, Stephanie mentioned a moment ago, policies about displacement. And that is something that cities are required to address in our comprehensive plans this time. So we have very few actual code regulation updates related to displacement. But we do need to have policies that address that. So one of the ways we're addressing that is through these comprehensive plan land use designations. We are now saying that manufactured home parks are going to be allowed uses in these residential districts, and you'll notice they were missing. So this now broadens the doors of the council in the future, wants to update our regulations to better accommodate manufactured home parks. There's the basis of it there for you. So that's a significant change in here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, and then the medium density designation, adding multiplexes and low-rise apartments, 3 stories or fewer, in line with what we described on the slides. And then adding accessory dwelling units as a possible secondary use. Again, the recommendation is to only allow them with single-family units as the primary, but single-family units can be built in this designation, so adding that as a secondary use as well. And then the high density residential designation, adding those manufactured home parks and subdivisions in here. And that was included in the medium, which is why that wasn't called out as a change because it's already there. And then saying that new single family uses are prohibited to not take up housing capacity in the high density district, although existing single family uses may remain. And then a little bit more detail on where this designation should be applied. For planned residential development for affordable senior housing. And so the conditions for that are having access to the appropriate services, where there's a buffer between low density and high density residential, and just a little more description on why design review will be required to ensure design appropriate to the neighborhood character. And then under mixed use, there was previously a designation called Historic Central Business District Town Center, and that was absorbed into the Town Center Plan overlay district area, so it's no longer relevant. Urban Village, a little bit of updated description here. Just kind of new wording that I think reflects a similar intent, but maybe a little bit more clear than the previous. So intended to be self-contained mixed-use areas with a compact street grid, interconnected pedestrian corridors that promote walkability through the neighborhood, supporting a mix of uses. And then a little bit of cleanup as well, talking about accessory dwelling units and duplexes and townhomes in this area. And just a note that, yeah, currently the only designated urban village in Sumner is the East Sumner Urban Village. So that's where this would apply. Under neighborhood commercial, adding a little bit of clarity. So calling out eating and drinking establishments as primary uses, and just describing that these are uses that serve primarily the immediate neighborhood and are not typically auto-oriented. And then in general commercial, a little bit of cleanup to the text for clarity.
We have another
No
question,
substantial.
Stephanie.
Hi,
Yes.
Stephanie, Jason again. Councilmember Elfers brought up in 732, kind of right in the middle there, where it starts with a strike through for limited multi. I believe in reading this, I tend to agree with, I think the second strike through where it starts with, it can be integrated into the proposed development as compatible, should actually remain. If you do strike it out, it doesn't make a complete sentence.
I see what you mean. Okay, we will take a closer look at that. But that makes sense. I can see where you're calling that out. It does not form a complete sentence, so it does seem like an error. And then interchange commercial, again, kinds of cleanup edits, nothing substantial.
Stephanie, we have another question, sorry.
Oh, yes.
I'm just looking at the last sentence of, it says modes including transit, bicycle, and modes. So,
Which policy, Ms. Vedetto?
7.3.2 on general commercial.
Transit, bicycle, I think, and pedestrian modes. Yeah, I will note that as well.
This doesn't make much sense.
Thank you.
So 7.3.3, yeah, cleanup edits. 7.4, light manufacturing, again, pretty limited edits to the clarity of the section. We did remove some amortization of existing businesses. I believe that was a staff edit early on. I'm not sure what that's referring to. Do you have any context for that one, Anne?
I do not. I think it was deemed unnecessary.
Okay. And then goals for site and building design, added quality building materials and modulation along street fronts. I think this is, yeah, essentially updating this in line with what the design guidelines for industrial development are dictating. Heavy manufacturing, minor, public and private facilities and utilities. Again, a little bit of cleanup here, given how this designation is actually used. And then overlay, just adding a little bit more context to what the shoreline area is. So generally 200 feet from the ordinary high water mark. Proposing to delete neighborhood plan districts, since Sumner no longer defines neighborhoods that way. And then community linkages as well, since that has never been really used as a true overlay district, but that same concept of walkable neighborhoods with transit is supported elsewhere in the plan. Manufacturing industrial center, light edits, innovation district and enterprise area, again, light edits just around compatibility, planned mixed use development, minor cleanup. And then manufactured home park overlay. So this is a substantial change. This is the kind of policy context from the slides around anti-displacement. So this says the manufactured home park overlay district applies to properties primarily in manufactured home park use where it was created prior to 2024. The purpose is to support continuation of manufactured homes as the primary use on the property and help ensure that they continue to provide affordable housing option for residents. Not intended to apply to new manufactured home parks, but may be applied in the future if residents become vulnerable to displacement and apply to the director for designation. It's a land use designation only and not intended to include any provisions for rent control or tenant protections. And so we don't have code at this time that's being proposed along with this new designation in the comprehensive plan. That's something that the city can consider next year with additional community engagement, but this is essentially creating the policy support for looking into that further.
And I just, Stephanie, if we could just pause for a moment, I just want to check with the council to make sure you understand what the intent is here. We're not going to change the comprehensive plan map because we have owners of 4 manufactured home parks in Sumner. And if we did actually change the map at some point in the future or change regulations, we would want to go through an adequate public notification process and make sure we notify them. We're talking, you know, maybe 2 owners apiece, 1 or 2 co-owners. So it's not a lot of people, but we need to make sure that they get adequate notice. So the policy doesn't change their status on the ground. The policy now will be in place so that if the council next year, following year, wants to go back and actually apply this overlay, then you have the policy basis to do that. Just wanted you to know that context too.
Thank you.
Is the mobile home park on East Valley on there?
I think there's a map. Stephanie, are you able
Double
to
A mobile home?
scroll?
Yeah.
Or was that
Double A
in the other
mobile?
one?
Yeah, it's on there.
Yeah.
Oh,
Senior
okay, 'cause
housing.
I
Yeah.
was-
Yeah,
There it is, Ms. Potato, if you see, yeah. Those are the-
Crystal Springs, Somerville Estates, and Rainier
I
Ranch.
can't read.
Rainier you-
You can read, you can't read it. Let's clarify.
I think even if it was big, I'm not sure you'd be able to read it. That's pretty blurry.
Mhm.
But it's on there.
They're there.
Can't
They're
see,
all there.
he can't hear.
I mean, I know.
No wonder we have issues.
Alright.
Yeah, so I was surprised when we went through this process to learn that there are 4 of these, and that's, you know, couple hundred people,
Yeah.
260 units total
Yeah.
or so.
yeah. So,
Big deal. The Rainier
Rainier
Manor, or View,
Rainier
that's the
Manor.
one where Manfred.
Yeah, around River Grove, off River Grove.
And Rainier Manor is unique in that the mobile homes are on their individual lots, whereas the other 3 are, they're lots, you know, to be leased, they're leased lots, but they're not boundary line lots. So, anyway. The idea is that in the updated policy and then eventually code is that these manufactured home parks would remain basically as manufactured home parks. You couldn't, a developer couldn't come in and purchase the property, get rid of everybody and all their mobile homes, and then redevelop it into, say, high-density multifamily,
Like they're doing in Puyallup.
like they've done in Puyallup and other places.
across the country.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Stephanie.
And then moving on to the land use designations table, you'll see in the low density residential designations that the upper end of the density has been updated, and that's just to reflect the fact that those areas now allow, would now allow 2 units per lot. So with 1 unit per lot, it was 5 dwelling units per acre in LDR1. Land use designation, which covers several zoning designations. That might be a little bit confusing. But essentially, they're doubling. The upper end is doubling because of the duplex allowance required by state. And then, oh, sorry, do you want to jump in?
So on the medium density, it shows 15, but then now it's only 22, not 30.
That's correct.
The reason for that density increase is when we have a policy proposed that says we want to get more to housing capacity in our medium density residential zone. And right now we don't allow apartments in medium density. So there's a policy in here that would allow small scale apartments up to 3 stories to be built. And so our consultants helped us figure out, well, what kind of density allowance do we need to get those smaller types of development? And I don't know if you recall that slide that Stephanie showed a few minutes ago of, it's the Sumner, across from Stafford. Yes, there it is, the Kincaid.
Yeah.
And the 15 dwelling units per acre, 19. We're trying to push that density up a little bit so we can get those small apartments that are 2, possibly 3 stories. So that's why it's not a direct 2.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And then just at the bottom here, there's a little bit of addition on that affordable housing on properties owned by religious organizations. So this is proposing applying the same requirements for that as affordable senior housing through the planned residential development process. So this is proposing that if you are a religious organization looking to build affordable housing on your property, you may be able to increase your density to 30 to 50 dwelling units per acre if following those conditions that are the same for affordable senior housing.
I have a question. So what if you had a different nonprofit that wasn't religious that wanted, could they have that same privilege, I guess?
They do in a different, through different avenues in our code. We have what we call a planned residential development, which a religious organization would go through as well. But a private developer or an NGO would be able to take advantage of these other code provisions that allow them density bonuses and height bonuses, but it's for, in our code, we only allow that for affordable housing or senior housing. So you need to be providing something to the community that the community needs, and you have to demonstrate that in order to get these bonuses. So yes, others in our code can take advantage of some of these incentives. But the state actually, we are required to actually allow this bonus for religious organizations.
So it's the state that's mandating that?
Yes.
Mhm.
And then the comprehensive plan map, it looks a little different than the one in the current plan, but that's just format. The actual designations are all the same as they currently are. Okay, and then moving on to the housing element, a little bit of additional text in the introduction around racially disparate impacts and housing cost burden, as well as displacement risk. There is an appendix to the environmental impact statement that covers this in more detail. But the Washington State Department of Commerce wanted to see more of it in the actual element itself. So we went ahead and added a little bit of context there. And then we also have the adopted housing targets in the introduction. And the county also provides some estimated supply numbers that the state also wants to see included in the element. And then moving on to goal 1. Some rewording of an existing goal to focus on public and private reinvestment in older residential neighborhoods and private rehabilitation of housing, rather than focusing on the wording of preservation of neighborhoods, which might be a little bit more subjective. And then 1.1, a little bit of clarification along similar lines, considering waiving or reducing permit fees for low-income housing rehabilitation projects. 1.2, review and revise regulations to encourage rehabilitation instead of demolition of existing homes where feasible. So still kind of gets at the intent of preserving existing housing stock through encouraging rehabilitation. Equitably invest in municipal infrastructure, capital replacement, repair and maintenance, including sidewalks, street trees, and parks. The previous policy was more wording around revitalization of older neighborhoods. And then 1.4, there's currently a policy on promoting good management, some wording around criminal activity in multifamily developments, and we suggested rewording around just generally promoting safety and deterring vandalism in residential neighborhoods through best practices. This one that's struck out has been combined with another goal. 1.5, promote county and local programs that reduce maintenance and rehabilitation costs for residents. Pierce County has a home repair program and home rehabilitation loan program that Sumner residents can qualify for. So just kind of providing information about what's currently out there. The next set of policies to be deleted just because design guidelines for all types of development are already addressed in the community character element. So just removing that to reduce redundancy, and some combination and rewording around accessory dwelling units and permitting obstacles to accessory dwelling units under goal 2. And then another strike through to be deleted since new state legislation requires adding more affordable options in Town Center and East Sumner Village. So the previous policy was around multifamily housing needing to be ground related, some kind of additional considerations there. And this update is kind of pushing the city to do more on affordability in those areas. And then policy support for preservation of existing mobile home and manufactured home parks as affordable housing. Under 2, there's an existing policy that is being proposed to be removed on planning for fair share of housing because the new state guidance around planning for all income bands supersedes that, so it's no longer relevant. 2.3, adding a little bit of language around design, encouraging design elements in housing that support transit access, pedestrian connections and universal access features for special needs populations, older adults, lower income, and residents with limited access to an automobile. Providing residents with information on existing programs on home ownership, like loan and down payment assistance for first-time home buyers, veterans, and residents with disabilities. Home ownership is a really big topic in the regional Vision 2050 plan, so this is in alignment with that. Planning for housing needs for all income bands, just revising this language to match the latest from the state.
Hey, Stephanie, we have a question.
Sure.
Thanks, Stephanie. This is again one of Councilmember Elfer's comments on 2.5. I'm gonna just read it because it's his words. On the intro paragraph, I want to add some language to give the city some wiggle room to adjust if state laws change or we get decision-making ability back. We are changing most of 2.5 because of mandates from the state rather than city-generated decisions. This is Andy speaking, would like to add some language to express this so that if and when the state changes it, we don't need to do a comp plan amendment to limit our flexibility as a city to zone these items. He suggested maybe adding something like as required by state law and GMA, plan for the adequate supply of land, ... and continue on from there. So maybe Stephanie, you could give us your opinion on that proposed change and then we can talk as a group.
Could I just, before we
Sure.
put Stephanie on the spot, maybe. So in that policy you see on your screen, 2.5, that's the overarching policy, and then there are a number of policies related to that that talk about allow 2 dwelling units per acre, allow 2 ADUs, and so on, everything directly coming from the state. I think what Mr. Elfers is asking that we could accommodate pretty readily is up in that first section 2.5 that says something that would cover all the rest of the sub-policies. If we were to say something like as required by state law and GMA, comma, plan for an adequate supply of land. So there's a nuance there that he's asking for, which in my opinion would not run afoul of any of our state requirements. Everything below that 2.5 header is directly related to being consistent with state requirements. So
Yeah,
That's actually his proposal, so.
is council comfortable with that?
I am.
That makes sense to
Yeah.
me.
Okay,
We all agree.
great, thank you. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you. Don't see any issues with that language. 2.5.1 is just revising language here to align with the Growth Management Act language. They call out some specific types of housing that should be allowed and accommodated throughout the state. So this is just updating the language to match their latest. 2.5.3, again, that 2 dwelling units on all lots zoned predominantly for residential use. 2.5.4, provide flexibility for larger lots in low density residential districts to build triplexes and fourplexes. That relates to that change around LDR 8.5 and 12, allowing larger lots to build those housing types, and you'll see that in the code as well. 2.5.5, around allowing for 2 accessory dwelling units in residential districts. 2.5.6, supporting development of accessory dwelling units by reducing regulatory obstacles. So this just calls out some examples of what that could look like. It doesn't commit the city to doing these, but you could provide pre-approved plan sets or reduce permit fees. 2.5.8, establish lot sizes and standards that maintain medium and high density residential zoning districts for higher density residential development. The city recently established a maximum lot size of 6,000 square feet for single family homes in these districts. So this is just a policy in line with that change. Some more minor language changes to the next set of policies. 2.5.12, just a language change, participate where appropriate with developers and agencies, as opposed to consider participation in the preparation of applications for federal or state housing funds. Some cleanup to 2.5.13, given cataloging reporting to the state on real property owned by the city no longer required for its purposes. That's not something that's actually required, but exploring your surplus lands as possibly a resource for affordable housing projects is a strategy that's recommended kind of in commerce guidance as well as Pierce County's policies. Implement the strategies in the 2021 Sumner Bonnie Lake Housing Action Plan.
Stephanie,
Oh, yes.
on that one, Councilmember Alfers wanted to have a discussion regarding the word implement. He feels that it might be too strong of a word, being that that plan is about 3 years old. Some of the ideas and strategies identified back then may not be relevant anymore, and so wanted maybe a little bit more wiggle room. That's what his thought was. He didn't come up with another word to propose, he just wanted to throw that out there.
What would you say?
Mm.
If you don't implement it, do you keep in mind?
Encourage, I don't know, that where appropriate, where, I
Where-
don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
I would say where appropriate, to give the council the authority to determine where it's appropriate. And you'll recall you established some priorities. So that the Housing Action Plan didn't mandate that you do take everything and implement everything. You actually went through that setting of priorities process. Things that were not very feasible or way at the, or palatable to the community were way at the bottom.
I guess it's 4 years old. I don't know that I've ever even seen it, so I'm having a
Okay.
hard time saying we should implement it.
It provides, it's a very valuable plan in providing the background and kind of a baseline for what does housing look like in Sumner and Bonnie Lake, and how available is housing, what people are cost burdened in our community and so on. And then out of that came a number of, Brian, maybe a half dozen?
14, yeah.
Okay.
There are 14 strategies that we could implement, and we've implemented about half of them. But we did kind of start with what was easy and what was kind of we felt most politically tenable, and then kind of moved down the list. And we adopted this in for Sumner, but it was a combination plan with Bonnie Lake. So I think I agree with Councilmember Elfers. We should provide a little bit more wiggle room, that we're not, absolutely required to implement every last strategy in there, but where feasible or
Where
where
appropriate.
appropriate, I think
Did you
is.
say refer to the?
That's what I was gonna say, or seek
refer
guidance,
to or consider the
strategies, yeah.
strategies.
Yeah, I mean,
Consider
anything,
would be good.
consider,
Or we still have implement if we just add the where feasible. I mean, it doesn't really, it just says if we can do it.
Yeah, we just don't know that we even, I think we could consider it.
Okay.
We could review it. I don't know that we wanna say we're gonna implement it. I'm not comfortable saying we're gonna implement it because I don't even know what it is I'm talking about. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but I don't even know what that is.
I would
We implemented
recommend,
any of these?
go ahead.
You said
Have
that
we
we've
implemented
implemented about
Yes,
6 or 8
yes,
of
we
them.
have, and
6 or 8 out of the
I just
14.
wanted to, remind the council of that, although some of you are new. We implemented the zero lot line development, we implemented new short subdivision standards, we implemented accessory dwelling unit standards, although we had to change those under this update. We also implemented affordable senior housing regulations. So there are a number of recommendations that came out of the Housing Action Plan that the community and the council have already followed through on and implemented. And we're, as Brian mentioned, the zero lot line subdivision implementation project. We have a developer who's already building and providing these great alternative modes of single-family home ownership. So I would recommend that the council commit to a strong statement about trying to carry forward all that work that was done on the Housing Action Plan, and saying something like implement where appropriate. And then as the council moves through time, or the council changes, then the council body can decide what's appropriate based on budget, staffing, or what the community needs at the time. That's my suggestion.
I like that, because you've already been implementing those strategies, so I think you should keep that term.
Do we know what the other ones are? If we've done 8, how many total? 14? Do we know what
Yeah,
the 6 are? Can we just, I hate to derail us for the sake of time, but I'm not comfortable with implementing something I don't know about. I can see that where feasible.
Well, that's. what-
Consider
and-
implementation where feasible. If we wanted to put that, consider implementation where feasible. The remaining strategies in the 2021 Sumner Bonnie Lake Housing Action Plan. That I could get behind, because that allows me to say, well, I don't think that's feasible. You know what I'm saying? But if I finally see it and go, how'd that make a list? Just saying.
I think, like Ann brought up a good point already, the state law has taken care of some of those things already,
Yeah,
and they've
yeah.
even changed, like, you know, we had ADU regulations that we adopted,
Mm-hmm.
and then the state came in and said, yeah, here's the goalpost, you gotta move your regulations again, so. Andy has a good point, that the plan might be starting to get a little stale,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's been 3 years and state has made a lot of changes.
Right.
So, for the sake of time, I'd rather not bring up the housing action plan and go
Okay.
through the 6 remaining things.
Yeah.
I think we can find some language, if you guys are comfortable.
Implement
Planner
where
Yeah, I heard a
expertise.
suggestion from Councilmember Bowman. I suggested something a little bit different, but
But I think I just heard implement where feasible.
Yeah.
Is that-
Something
that's what I
like
was
that.
trying to
Yes.
sort
That's
of.
what I
Works
wrote
good.
down.
I think we're all
Consider
good with that. I see a hand. Oh, it's Lisa.
I just had maybe one other thing to offer at the end of the sentence. You could say, as amended. So implement where feasible the strategies in the 2021 Sumner Bonnie Lake Housing Action Plan as amended, because you'll probably be revisiting it at some point.
Yeah, that's
I like
great.
it.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I can
I
live
think
with
we
that.
like as amended.
I'm okay with that.
Excellent. Thank
Like
you.
saying, I'm gonna give you $1,000, and I don't even have $1,000. Where's it gonna go? I promise.
Thanks, Stephanie.
So moving along, 2.5.15 for SEPA environmental reviews of housing construction, establish thresholds for SEPA exemptions to streamline the review process, consistent with allowed state thresholds. Yeah, that's around making environmental review simpler for certain project types for housing construction, which can help kind of facilitate that process. Support affordable housing development by religious organizations through density bonuses and consider fee waivers. We're not proposing implementing any fee waivers at this time, but something to consider for the future. Evaluate potential impacts and benefits of short-term rentals on the use of accessory dwelling units and other housing units. That's something that the Planning Commission asked staff to explore. They wanted staff to look at limiting short-term rentals to limit potential impacts on housing availability, and they recommended the policy wording above. And that isn't something that is in line with kind of Commerce recommendations, restricting short-term rentals of accessory dwelling units. But currently, as it reads, the next step would be to evaluate the potential impacts and benefits. It's not actually creating any restrictions at this time.
We have a question, Stephanie.
Sure.
So when you talk short-term rentals, what does that mean? Is that like Airbnbs
Mhm.
or things like that? What is-
Because people will, you know, they'll own one, they'll own an ADU, and then they'll rent it out as a short-term rental, and then it doesn't ever get into actual kind of housing stock for
Oh.
potential supply or affordability. It's
Can
one of
we
the,
allow short-term rentals in Sumner?
yeah, we don't not
Without
allow them.
Any licensing or not?
Typically, they get business licenses.
Thank you.
The next one, collaborate with other Pierce County jurisdictions on housing affordability through the South Sound Housing Affordability Partnership, which is something the city's already doing. 2.7, support the reclamation of mine sites for housing once mining operations end. There is the Kava mine site in the city that I believe has said that they expect to finish their operations in the next 8 years or so. I don't know if Brian has more context on that, but essentially this is something that might come up in the next 10 years.
We have a question.
So, how long has South Sound Housing Authority Partnership been in operation? And are they likely to be a long-term agency, or is it something like in 5 years, oh, they disbanded, so, I mean,
No,
is it smart to have a specific name?
Yeah, I think in this case, it's fair to and smart to have a specific name
Okay.
in here. The South Sound Housing Affordability Partnership is envisioned to remain much like the similar organizations in King County, because eventually they're developing properties. It's kind of a long-term play on developing affordable housing in Pierce County. Arch, I can't remember what it stands for, is in King County, and Arch has been around for like 30 years. They have about 40,000 affordable units that they've been responsible for, so we're just barely getting started. South Sound Affordability Partnership, I think, has been in place since 2018, maybe 2019,
So it's
not
like-
very long,
Yeah,
3, 4, 5 years.
so is it smart to have a specific agency name? That's,
I think in this case, it's
you
fine.
wouldn't have to do anything in the future if they disbanded and,
Well, I guess I'm betting they won't.
Okay.
I'm suggesting you leave it in there.
okay.
I was just gonna see if I could help with a suggestion where we add something like such as collaborate with, I don't wanna muddy the waters here, but if there was something like with other Pierce County jurisdictions on housing affordability through this particular partnership or similar partnership, the name could actually change even, they could be
Well,
the
that's
same.
my concern
might
is
be
if
what you're-
there's a, yeah.
You could add or similar partnerships or similar organizations, something like that.
that would be-
You guys all okay with that? Okay, yes. Okay, we can continue.
Sure, thank you. 2.9, just added to the current policy around promoting fair and equal access to housing for all persons in accordance with state law. We've added by connecting residents to information on tenant protections. 2.10, this is around that 5-year reporting requirement. So just updating an existing policy to reflect that new 5-year time period. So that's around permit processing timelines, housing affordability, and housing availability. And there's a similar requirement for reporting on climate impacts as well. And then there's a few policies here that have been moved to other sections. So this one about town center transition areas was moved. This one about developing senior housing in the downtown was moved above. And then programs around good management, kind of crime-free, resistant housing, safe street concepts was also moved above. And then 3, encourage energy efficiency in housing developments, has some new language kind of to get a little bit more specific. So 3.1 is previously generally promoting use of energy conservation features. Proposal is to encourage energy conservation, energy efficiency in building materials and site design, and application of sustainable or green development practices. 3.2, kind of calling out that the city is looking to reduce reliance on automobiles by promoting higher density and infill developments, and by supporting a network of transit stops, connecting neighborhoods to the station, to the Sumner Commuter Transit Station. A little bit of cleanup on policy 3.3 around continuing to enforce energy code, other building codes. Under 3.4, which is around landscaping and parking lots, specifically calling out adopting flexible street standards to allow for narrower streets in appropriate locations to reduce pavement area. 3.6, there's an existing policy about promoting programs that minimize utility costs, just adding a little bit more detail there, particularly programs that support seniors and households with lower incomes, and then calling out specific examples of what that can look like bill assistance, weatherization programs, pipe repairs, appliances, that kind of thing. You'll see in a couple of places where policies previously said single-family residential. This is proposing changing that language to low-density residential, since with the new 2 dwelling units per residential lot, single-family residential is not accurate. A little bit of just language cleanup on 4.8. The previous was to adopt a multifamily tax exemption allowance. Now there is one, so we're suggesting language change to maintain that allowance, and specifically calling out in town center affordable housing developments being qualified for that exception only, instead of just generally multifamily. Goal 5, support high density multifamily development in apartments and key locations in the East Sumner neighborhood plan area. This is just adding some policy language around that multifamily tax exemption in East Sumner. And then 6 is around anti-displacement, so support measures to prevent or mitigate residential displacement through tenant protections and existing programs. 6.1 is to consider working with agencies to provide public information on county state programs on things like eviction protection, etc. 6.2, considering supporting tenant protections, such as tenant relocation assistance, just cause eviction protections, and notice of intent to sell consistent with state law, so supporting those that already exist. And
Stephanie, we
then,
have a question.
sure.
Thank you, Stephanie. Councilmember Elfers was concerned with 6.2. He would rather take an incentive approach. He does not believe that the current language really does anything but harm landlords, and it makes it more difficult for affordable housing. I see this came from the Planning Commission, so maybe Ann, you could speak to 6.2 and what their thoughts were and what does it mean with consistent with state law?
Sure. I think when you look at all of the policies under goal 6, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, you'll notice that it says consider working with, consider supporting, and so on. I recall originally we had work with agencies and support tenant. It was a much more direct and assertive role for the city to take in the original wording. And recognizing, similar to what Mr. Elfers recognized, the city has a limited role in taking on these kinds of actions. We have limited resources, limited staff, and these types of protections also change all the time. So not all the time, but they are subject to change as new approaches become better, more effective. So we toned down the wording for that very reason, to consider supporting. Now that said, we could have some additional wording in here that tones that down even further, as long as we still have policies in here that show the state that we are addressing tenant displacement. So if we water down the language too much, these won't be policies that we can show the state to say, look, we are going to move forward on some of these, and it may be just in a small incremental way given our resources, but we do support these kinds of programs. This is a real challenge. We struggled with this a lot with the Planning Commission for this reason.
Well, I think when I see it, this is why I sold a rental house in this town, because the state made it really hard to evict people. So, and even, fortunately, when I wanted to sell it, the tenant that I had was really great about that, right? But had they pushed back, I could have had a real mess on my hands. So I know we need to do things because of the state edict. I'm going to call it mandates, but do we need to leave that in there? I mean, is this something that if it's not in there, that we would feel some adverse reaction? Or I see your point about consider supporting it, and that doesn't mean that we have to support it, but What kind of was the thought there, just to keep it soft, and can we
Yeah,
soften
that
it
was-
even more?
That was exactly it, and I think
Well, I
Mr. Elfers is asking for
Yeah.
something. I think he's asking, part of his ask is remove that 6.2 altogether.
Yeah,
And I don't recommend that, because I think we will have a gap when we go to the state
mm-hmm,
and try to show how we're addressing displacement.
so here
Yeah, I
we're
was
saying,
just-
well, think about it.
I was just gonna add that it does end with consistent with state law. I don't know if that needs to be moved around or not, be put in front of the sentence, but the way I read this, we need to consider all of these things consistent with state law. So in other words, we're not gonna go above and beyond whatever state law is going to basically require us to do. We're recognizing these are some tools out there, but we're gonna be consistent with state law as compared to like the city of Tacoma that has gone above and beyond state law and made things even more difficult for landlords anyway. So I think, I don't know if I'd change it, if there's some more wiggle language we could have in there, great, but I think the way I read it, it's like, hey, we're gonna do what we have to do according to state law.
What about consider supporting tenant protections consistent with state law?
And not all the,
And not all the stuff in between? Cause that's what we're saying.
List all in there.
You know, if you have all that stuff listed in there, it kind of makes you, cause it says such as.
But I think tenant relocation assistance is, I think it's important. I would not want it to be removed. It could be a single-family home, but it also could be a big apartment complex that
Mhm.
someone's going to tear down.
Or
And-
manufactured home park.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see that, Pat.
And our consultants helped us with this wording. I think the examples in here are not telling us these are the one and only strategies. I think they're giving us examples, which is important, because if we left it at consider supporting tenant protections, what does that mean? That to me would be too broad. We could also go back to the term that we've used before, consider where feasible. To the extent feasible, consider working with agents. And I'm kind of looking at these three policies as a group. Consider to the extent feasible, adopting.
What if we just put consistent with state law, consider supporting tenant protection, just put that the first,
let's move that.
just move it
To
up
the
front,
front.
and then that's your focus. Really,
It says the bar.
Cause that's what we have to do.
right, we have to do it anyway, and then you consider supporting tenant protection such as.
Recognize that we know that.
Can we
So
do that?
what do you think about that? And it really is just moving consistent with state law
To the front.
to the front.
Swap it.
I think that makes sense.
Looking at our attorney real quick.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna be the unpopular opinion in the room, but watering this down runs the risk of having the state say, you're no longer complying with the Uniform Relocation Act, you're no longer complying with the Residential Landlord Tenant Act, and by and large, the city's pretty hands-off when it's a private rental unit with a landlord and a tenant, but when we condemn property or when we acquire property, there are tons of state laws that and federal laws that govern relocation of tenants. And so it's really not just limited to state law, and I would hate to water it down so much that we no longer bind ourselves to those processes.
That makes sense too. Okay. Well, it does. I mean, that gives a little more context.
I have a question for our city attorney. If we were to say consistent with state law, that would apply to the city being consistent with state law or a private developer, would it not?
I think this applies only to city-led actions. Yeah, not so much developers. Unless we're implementing protections through our code that require certain things of developers. Developers are already bound by the Residential Landlord Tenant Act.
Right,
If
right.
they run afoul of that, they will be in civil court quickly. So this really has to do with what the city is going to do to protect tenants.
Yeah, and that's where Ann opened up with the city of Sumner, limited staff, limited resources, to be, you know, actively having a tenant relocation assistance program, or going out and, you know, following up on eviction protections, or, you know, certain types of noticing and that kind of thing, I guess. I mean, it could be an unfunded mandate, we just have to do it, but I think here we're kind of trying to be realistic about what the city of Sumner's capabilities actually are in regard to this.
Right, and when it comes to, like I said, a private rental unit, the city is pretty hands-off
Right,
unless it's a code
exactly.
enforcement issue where it's uninhabitable, and we then are pretty involved. Our building official does the punch list, and we're telling a tenant, you have to leave, and there are relocation assistance programs in that. I read this as coming into play when the city acquires a piece of property and we're relocating a tenant, or when the city is the landlord, which on occasion does happen.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So just the city.
I think the intent that, and from a legal perspective, that may be how it's being read, but the intent was to look at possible expanding the role of the city
Yeah.
to private development.
Private sector.
Yeah.
If somebody, if an apartment complex is being demolished and all the people are being evicted, does the city have a role?
In that
And-
context, you'll wanna minimize the city's involvement, because that is already
That's
governed
already by
by
the state.
the Landlord Tenant Act,
And
right?
that's exactly why I wanted to start, suggested, consistent with state law, and then, okay, we'll do what we need to according to state law, if it's building official inspections and checklists and whatever, but we're not going to have our own administered tenant relocation assistance program at the city of Sumner.
That makes sense.
So does this, you'd be okay with moving those
Gone full
4
circle.
words to the beginning, or leave it as is?
I
What's
think
your
it gives the
recommendation?
sentence more context to have that at the start. I would add even federal law, to make sure it's complete. It's just that
Fair
word
Housing
consider
Act.
supporting. You never wanna say, well, consider following the law.
Might be a thought.
Consider implementing where feasible. I don't know, the word support is throwing me off because I read that to be synonymous with following.
Andrea, another way that this could be read with consistent with state law at the end is supporting tenant protections, could even be supporting legislation that's working its way through
Absolutely.
the state legislature, right? We may not want to take a position on that.
Mhm.
It could also mean tenant relocation assistance. I mean, there's nothing that says we couldn't give some of our money to the county to support
Right.
tenant relocation assistance, but we're not required to at this time.
Mhm.
So I do think if council wants to take a stance, you need to move consistent with state and federal law up to the beginning, because there are opportunities for us to take a more active role in this, if council so chose to do so.
I'm feeling like we're in agreement with,
Bring back
pending
the
it
front.
with consistent with state and federal law.
Yeah.
Okay,
At the beginning
at the beginning.
of 6 policy 6.2.
6.2, yes.
Okay, good, thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Tiffany.
And then 6.3 is around that manufactured home park overlay that we discussed, and consider adopting provisions in the zoning code such as special zones or development standards that protect manufactured home parks over other types of housing developments. So same topic as prior. And then we can move into the code changes. So
Stephanie,
these are,
I'm
yes.
sorry, can we take a break?
Yes.
Real quick, last time we went to the comp plan, we did not go through the code changes, so is council okay not going through the code changes tonight and just sticking with the policies?
I think if I may,
Yeah.
Mr. Wilson.
Of course,
I think
you're the
it's,
expert.
I think it is really important, and Stephanie, if you could go through the codes and just highlight the key changes, the significant changes, because the code is really the language that is gonna direct developers to do something, direct a property owner like the city to do something. So we have a housing and land use code. It's not very we have critical areas code to go through with you, and we have our historic cultural resources code, if we can get to that tonight. So the housing code is a pretty important piece of this. It significantly changes what we're doing. That said, you have just seen all the policies, so the code, you're gonna see kind of the mirror image of the policies, but I would like the council to see the language.
How about if we just do the housing and land use codes as opposed to all of them? What do you guys think, or you want to see everything?
So we haven't even gotten to critical areas in the environment sections. It's 7:40. So Anna and I, we talked earlier tonight, we're like, where's a good natural break? And if we could get through environment tonight and push historic cultural preservation off to November 12th, that'd probably be best. But I also know that even if we just do environment tonight, we're probably looking at it a little after 9. So I wanted to run that by you and see what your guts
Or it
are.
could be, my estimate is maybe 8:30.
All depends how many questions everybody has.
Don't ask questions.
No, you can ask all the questions you want.
Okay, what say you?
Well, I'm open to anything. I'm not, for the sake, I will not ask questions just because of the time of day.
No.
That's just who I am, so I will apologize in advance, so just know that. If we say, oh, we're gonna hammer through it, okay. There's only so much you can absorb in your brain.
I'm good.
Let's keep on going and knowing that we do have an exit lane before historic and cultural preservation.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yep.
Okay, so Stephanie, briefly, the housing code, if you could, please.
Sure. So the first section is some updates to definitions in line with what we've talked about, a little bit on accessory units, just kind of some cleanup here on some key definitions, as well as adding a definition for community gardens, since that's a use that we're adding to the zoning districts below. Low density residential districts, some language around accessory dwellings, and duplexes being allowed on any one lot instead of a single family detached dwelling. Multiplexes, that same point about larger parcels in LDR 8.5 and 12, allowing multiplexes instead of a single family dwelling. And then allowing community gardens in low density residential as well. Conditional uses, adding manufactured housing development, including manufactured home parks and manufactured home housing subdivisions, which we talked about previously. Adding that affordable multifamily housing on properties owned by religious organizations being allowed through a planned residential development, same part of the code as the multifamily senior housing bonus. And then just some updates to descriptive pieces around permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, no longer one unit allowed on each lot in the LDR, but anything exceeding 2 dwellings being subject to additional performance standards. Accessory dwelling units, there's quite a bit of change in here. We covered some of this in the slide, but essentially allowing 2 per legal building lot, unless the building lot is below the minimum lot size for that zone. So if it's already too small for the zone, you cannot build accessory dwelling units. Removing the owner occupancy requirement. In parking, the city already has provision for allowing accessory dwelling units to not have off-street parking if they're within half mile of Summit Transit Station, but it is currently requiring the applicant to demonstrate that there is enough on-street parking, and that is no longer in line with state law. So outright, if you build an accessory dwelling unit within half mile of Summit Transit Station, it does not need to have off-street parking. Removing restrictions in the LDR 4 zone that currently only allow them to be built within the primary dwelling unit. That's no longer in line with state law. Appearance and layout regulations, we've struck through except for where accessory dwelling units are constructed with a subdivision. So then they are subject to the same requirements, the other buildings in that subdivision, but other design review requirements are not currently in line with state law. Height, currently the code says ADUs can be a maximum of 18 feet, bumping that up to 24 in line with state law, unless the house is less than 24 feet in height. And so then the ADU can't be any taller than the principal unit. Making all setbacks the same as for the primary dwelling unit, except for where there's an alley, in which case the ADU can be located on the lot line. And then ADUs, shorter ADUs could be allowed kind of closer to the rear property line. So allowing ADUs a maximum of 18 feet in height when located kind of within that 15-foot setback from the rear and 7.5 feet from interior side yard lot line. So basically, in those kind of areas that are closer to the lot lines, the city is allowed to require them to be shorter. Conversion to an accessory dwelling unit of an existing structure, so like a garage, updating the provisions associated with that to be in line with state law. So basically, if you convert the structure, it can't be any more non-conforming than it already is, but you have to be allowed to convert it. And it has to be something that was converted, that was legally constructed prior to the adoption of this code in order to convert it. Let's see. You can expand a structure that you're converting to an accessory dwelling unit, but you have to make sure that the expanded building is not, jutting more into setbacks and it's not any taller than the maximum height. In medium and high density residential, making new single family dwellings subject to that maximum lot size that we mentioned that's already been adopted in the code. And then single family dwellings legally constructed prior to the adoption of this code are permitted to remain in MDR and HDR zones as well. Making sure the manufactured home line aligns with that same intent. So making sure that high density zones are maintained for high density housing and not single family homes. Allowing apartments up to 3 stories in the medium and high density residential. Same with triplexes and fourplexes and community gardens. And allowing ADUs subject to all of the requirements that we covered previously on height and setbacks, etc. Okay, and then striking through some text on ADUs that's no longer relevant. And clarifying the manufactured home park, manufactured housing development use in this zone. Senior housing and low income housing, there are existing provisions for that bonus for multifamily senior housing through that planned residential development process, adding again that affordable housing on properties owned by religious organizations. And then updating the density table to reflect that change in medium density residential from 15 to 22 dwelling units per acre. Striking through the requirement that manufactured homes have to be new. And striking specific roof pitch requirements. Commercial districts, adding, again, that affordable multifamily housing on properties owned by religious organizations with that bonus. And community gardens. East Sumner Urban Village overlay, same thing. And then planned residential development. This is the section of code that allows senior housing to have density bonuses and just adding that affordable multifamily housing on properties owned by religious organizations. So all of this pertains to that topic. And the requirements to go through that process are in line with what is currently in the code for senior housing developments. Okay, we just have a placeholder or kind of a note on displacement provisions. Those are all in policy language. There's nothing in the code that relates to that topic other than that adding manufactured home parks isn't allowed, conditional use. And then design review, no longer requiring it for accessory dwelling units. Again, that's a state requirement. And then we have our standards for permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency shelters, and emergency housing. And all of these are doing what we said in the slides, which is making sure that the occupancy limits are based on fire code and nothing else. And the housing density is based on the zone, and that any spacing requirements are no more than 880 feet. So all of these are related to that. Still related to supportive housing. And then we have multifamily tax exemption, updating maps and text in chapter 3.52 around incentivizing affordable housing development in town center, limiting the MFTE to affordable developments, and expanding the area in which the East Sumner MFTE can be applied. And then the same maps that were in the slides. So that is everything under housing and land use.
Any questions? Okay.
It's a lot of work.
Okay. So I'm thinking we can move on to environment, and I'm wondering if we want to start with critical areas while we have Claire on the line, and then we can go into the policy language. How does that sound?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
Great. Claire, whenever you're ready, you can go through the slides and then the code.
Okay, just want to, okay, we're going to start with the critical areas code.
I think that's.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I need to turn you up a little bit. All right, so I've got a long night already. I'll try and be clear. My name is Claire. I work for Parametrics. Been working with Stephanie and Lisa on these the comp plan and the critical areas code. So we are proposing some updates to the critical areas ordinance to the code. The key goal of the critical areas code is to complement the land use and other regulations in the city and to protect people, public and private property from natural hazards, protect the environment, enhance quality of life. Critical areas are wetlands, critical aquifer recharge areas, also known as groundwater, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, which include streams, and frequently flooded area and geologically hazardous areas, so steep slopes, erosion hazard areas, that sort of thing. The regulations need to be updated based on best available science, and we are working through that update. Go ahead, Stephanie. We had a number of changes. Some of them are just some cleanup, added definitions, that sort of thing. We added a partial exemption. You previously just had an exemption before that. And this is just for some activities that will require minimal review. Previously, those portions were just exempt. And we wanted to be able to have those parcels that had critical areas on them come into City Hall and get a little bit more guidance from the city, just to make sure that they were going to be able to avoid impacts to critical areas. There was also some clarifications on the variance approval process, which was needed a little bit of cleanup. So hopefully that's a little bit more streamlined. And also clarification again on non-conforming uses. So non-conforming uses are things that are already within that critical area. And so there's just a few more guardrails on what people can do with, for example, a house that's within a wetland buffer. There's also been some language that's been added to clarify what a disconnected buffer is. So currently practice is, and it's codifying a current practice, which is if you have a buffer on a wetland or a stream, but there's this, and that buffer is 100 feet, for example, and it comes up to a road at 50 feet, that buffer ends at that road, at the impervious surface, because the buffer is no longer functional. So we're just adding language to the code that clarifies that. We also updated the buffer widths for streams, and then updated stream buffer reductions as well. So, was there a question?
Nope, I think we're good.
Okay, Anne alluded to this at the beginning, but the biggest change that we have made is an update to the stream buffers. And this is based on recommendations from the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. So the buffer, so you currently have fish-bearing streams, you have a buffer of 100 feet, and we're not recommending any change for that. We are, however, recommending changing the buffer for non-fish bearing streams. They previously had a buffer of 25 or 50 feet, and we're recommending an increase to 100 feet. And we did a study of the streams, fish bearing, non-fish bearing streams in the city, and compared what WDFW recommends to your existing buffers, and what changes could occur, and what would be the implications for that. For the city. The state recommends buffers, what they're calling riparian management zones, up to approximately 231 feet, which is a pretty significant increase for, say, a buffer, which is currently 25 feet. And so we looked at where those impervious surfaces were. Actually, let me follow the slides a little bit more rather than going off. So the state recommends a minimum buffer of 100 feet, that you get the most bang for your buck, so to speak, in that first 100 feet for removing pollutants. So removing nitrates, and also different types of pesticides. The city's buffers were last updated in 1992, so they need to better reflect best available science. And so in the city of Sumner, most of your fish-bearing streams are in the lowland areas and the flat, and your non-fish-bearing streams are on the hillsides around the edges. And some of those non-fish-bearing streams are in fairly steep areas. They're in a ravine, and they also have some landslide hazard areas that already have some additional restrictions. Next, please.
Claire?
Yep. Yeah.
I wonder if you or Stephanie could put the DNR stream map. I think it's in the environment element embedded in that. If you could put that up and just give the council an idea of where our fish-bearing streams are and the non-fish-bearing tributaries that are subject to this change.
Yeah. It's on page 92 of the PDF if you want to keep scrolling.
We'll go ahead. We'll show you on the screen. You don't have to.
There it is.
Council members.
Yeah, so it's just to orient you here. First of all, the White River goes through the middle, and that's covered on the Shoreline Management Act. So there's no changes to the buffers or setbacks on the White River.
Excuse me, can you blow that up a little, enlarge that a little bit? Yeah, great.
And then you have can you scroll down so we can see the legend, Stephanie? Yeah, there we go. Maybe, yeah, okay. Fish-bearing streams are that purpley cyan color. And can you scroll a little bit so we can see a little bit more of the map? Thanks. And then, as you can see, most of that purple is kind of on the lowland areas there. You also have down on the south there, and then along the highway 167. And then a lot of that area, if you think about those areas, they're already fairly developed. And so if you, in the city part, and then the orange and the yellow, you can't really see the yellow all that great, but primarily the orange are non-fish bearing streams, and the yellow are called non-type streams. They just WDFW hasn't provided a type, but almost all of them are orange. And those ones are type N, and they're think about where they're located, those are fairly steep areas, the more the forested areas of the city, the less undeveloped. Some of the down in the southeast, that area is owned by the city on the hill slope there and is protected already for drinking water and for wells with the city there.
Great, thank you, Claire. I just wanted the council to see.
Yeah.
So Claire, just the council's clear, so the purple ones, that's fish bearing, and what you'll notice is the purple, it's the same stream, and as you go up into the hillside, it transitions to orange. And so the recommendation is that we go from a 25 to 50-foot buffer on that orange section up to 100 feet. The importance of that is the same stream, right? So the protections further upstream help keep contaminants and things from getting into that water that would affect downstream. And it's also steep slopes. So there's already a lot of, I mean, as a property owner, your biggest concern would be, wow, you're going from a 25-foot or 50-foot impact to what I could do with my property to 100. But in reality, if it's in a steep sloped area, it's already has a lot of restrictions on development. And so if you get down to brass tacks and you're like, hey, I want to build a garage on my property, you may be already restricted to where you can put it and how much you can build based on the steepness of the slopes. So that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. And she also pointed out there's those areas that are within the city watershed or Puyallup watershed that's not going to be developed either. So we are, and we have, we did notify all the property owners along these sections of stream from the Planning Commission hearing, and we'll notify them in a similar manner, direct mailings to these property owners for the council public hearing as well, so they're fully informed of these changes.
So in what we're looking at here, to also give you an idea of the scale, there are about 44 parcels and about 24 different landowners affected. So we would do another mailing to these 24 landowners. And I think 4 or 5 of the landowners are agencies like Cascade Water Alliance and Puyallup Watershed and City of Sumner. So I would say probably about 20 private owners would be affected by the stream buffer.
And Dan, can you go over with council, how did we determine these were the streams? And what if that stream's really not there?
Oh, sure. So this is the challenge with all of our critical areas mapping. We have wetlands maps similar to this. We have steep slope maps. We have stream maps. These are all based on a broader level mapping, usually done by the state. In this case, this is based on a Department of Natural Resources map. So these stream locations are provided to us by Department of Natural Resources, but they have never had staff on the ground walking up those streams. So, and this map isn't always trued up to the actual parcel lines. So with all of our critical areas regulations, the responsibility is always on the property developer they choose to develop to do the actual field work and determine where the stream is or where the wetland is. And then they would evaluate the quality of the stream, the type of stream, just confirm, do the ground truthing, so that when they come in for their permits to the city, the planner working with them then works with them to make sure that the stream is mapped correctly, they get guidance from DNR and so forth. So this is a guide for city staff and for property owners, but it may not be the exact location of those streams.
Okay, we can continue.
Yeah, that map also had the wetlands on it, which were the little green polygons, and their wetlands have buffers on them as well and additional protections. Let's see, next slide, please, Stephanie. So that was the recommendation for the buffers. And then we also changed and clarified, because we changed the stream buffers, we recommended just also amending the buffer reduction process so that you can't reduce it to less than 75 feet. So the same for it'll be the same for non-fish bearing streams as well. It'll be, so you were previously allowed to reduce it to 20 to 25 feet. It's now going to be a reduction up to 75 feet. And this change needs to go through an approval process, administrative approval. And then there's a number of some criteria that a landowner would need to meet for improving that existing buffer if they were to get approval to reduce that buffer. And there's a couple of those criteria that are noted there. Yeah. Any questions or comments?
I think we're good.
Thank you, Claire. Claire,
Okay.
if you have a minute, what I would like to suggest to the council, so there's two parts to this topic. There's the environment element or chapter with the policies, and then there's the critical areas code. And my suggestion to the council is that we not review the critical areas regulations. Claire's prepared to do that if you like, but that's 23 pages of code about wetlands and buffers and so on. What we have though that we could go through, and Mr. Elfer's made some comments on this, is the environment element where the policies are. So the critical areas code that you see up there on the screen, what Claire just reviewed with you, I believe captures the significant changes in the environment code. The other changes, they get pretty technical, pretty esoteric, and they're directly responding to a state requirement. So if the council wishes, we could go through those, or they're in your packet. Those code changes are in your packet, so you could look at those and give us comments at another point, or email us with comments if you like.
What do you guys think?
I'm
We
good
can
with
skip
that.
the codes for the critical areas? Yes.
Okay.
Pat, you're okay with that?
So, Stephanie if we can just go to the environment element, and Claire, if you could hang on for a minute. while we-
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Can we, what page is it?
Yeah, thank you.
What page? I don't have the PDF.
I don't have the full packet, I have two different ones. So we can start with the PowerPoint, Stephanie or Claire, whoever's doing that, and then we'll get you a page number.
Okay.
So similar, we updated the environment element of the comprehensive plan, and the updates are primarily intended to strengthen resiliency, reduce emissions, and and added in some similar language to what Stephanie was discussing about equity. It's a common theme throughout. So we added also environmental stewardship and education, and like I said, environmental justice into the project decisions, preparedness for extreme weather events, also addressing air quality impacts on overburdened communities, water quality within buffers, preserving vegetation for protection in critical aquifer recharge areas, accessibility and emergency notification. So if there's an eruption or something like that, that's available in multiple languages, that sort of thing. Floodplain protection, mitigation, that's been updated to bring it in more in alliance with a more best available science, and updated the language. And then we also added some urban forestry management and protecting forests and hillsides, and then again, reducing emissions and supporting alternative energy technologies.
So if you have the full packet open, it's page 83. If you have just the exhibit open, It's page 50.
So I added in this text at the beginning that just updates the call out up to best available science. And then we just added the definition of critical areas in the city of Sumner, wetlands, critical aquifer recharge areas, etc. We also added text about functions and values, which is the benefits of having these critical areas, water quality protection, that sort of thing. And then getting into the goals and policies. Again, these are just updated to address some of the Washington Administrative Code. And then incorporating best available science, just a change in language about that. You already had some in there about best available science, but there's added this, we also needed to add in the preserve or enhance anadromous fish, which is salmon. And then also moving on to the next page, again, it being more inclusive, so promoting cultural events that celebrate and inform communities. Again, more education, working with the school district and other organizations. I'm going to skip a little bit. So again, environmental justice into future projects. And again, we have some addressing stormwater develop a continued program to assist the public in preventing stormwater damages through proper trimming. So again, this is all kind of education related. I'm gonna skip on to air quality. So just a few updates here, including like just some more clarity in language, supporting infrastructure codes, encouraging electric vehicles, that sort of thing. And again, this theme of equity, so addressing, engaging with the community and acknowledging overburdened communities. Just some cleanup in language for the noise section here. Natural resource land, we could go up just, yeah. So just acknowledging, so natural resource lands includes agriculture and mining. And then it's just updated the language to be consistent with state code. And then it also changed, sorry, I have to pause here, right. Yeah, there's you have a requirement for right to farm, that's a WAC, and you are a state code requirement. We just clarified that language based on what kind of agriculture you actually have. And then surface water, so that is primarily streams, but it would also include wetlands. We updated, here we're just talking about updating those, the protection of wetlands and buffers for functions and values, so acknowledging the role that these wetlands and streams have. Deleted some redundancies.
Stephanie. On 5.10, Councilmember Elfers feels that the word require is too strong. Developers already have a lot of environmental regulations to comply with, and they keep on getting more complex. He would prefer something like collaborate with, promote, or support. So it's more cooperative in tone rather than punitive. Turn it over to council.
Well, I mean, promoting, I mean, does it have to be required?
It doesn't, I don't believe it has to, but recognize that I believe it's already required.
Yeah.
Right, and Mr. Clerk is nodding his
Don't
head,
think so.
you know. So we have to comply with the, I think it's King County's surface water manual. And that guides developers and how they grade their land, what kind of infrastructure they put in for stormwater, and how much impervious surface they can have, how they treat that and so on. And I believe part of the requirement is low impact development, trying to balance new development with the original hydrologic character and functioning of the site. So since this is a policy, we could probably say encourage or promote, and then leave the requirement to our code that is adopted elsewhere that says require.
It already says where feasible.
At the end.
Yeah, require it where it's feasible. I mean, I
So
think
maybe put where
pretty
feasible
well
on the front.
stated.
Probably same difference. It's where
Right.
feasible. Thank you for pointing that out.
I mean, it's already in there where feasible, so I mean, I think it's a good sentence.
And so that's why, I just wonder, is it required? If it's required, we gotta leave the word in there.
Well, I think, I'm trying to find it in here, I'm not real familiar with all our stormwater regs, but I believe the first thing you have to do is kind of, the go-to is low impact. So you look for how you can do it in a low impact way, and then if that doesn't work, then you have to look at a more potentially conventional way of managing your stormwater. But they're required to look at low impact first. And I'm not in front of the policy, too many things open here, but does that go back kinda, is that what the policy kinda says too? Let's see here.
That's
But
why I
it does
just,
say where feasible.
yeah.
And it might be require, comma, where feasible, residential, if the nuance
Sure.
changes a little bit.
Just put it up there in the front. I mean, isn't that what we're saying?
Yeah, it's the same thing. I think it doesn't change the gist of it. If we just say require where feasible. Are we all in agreement with that?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, just move the words around, so.
They made me do it.
It's-
Down the road.
You're good.
Low impact. It's about $80,000 worth of stuff.
That's not low impact.
$80,000 worth of low impact.
Well, the low impact to me.
Okay,
I think that's a good example of how many things are really not within our purview.
I mean, you know, it's, they want me flooding the neighbor's basement for the third time. All right, I don't blame you.
Okay.
Turned on your faucet.
Go ahead, Claire. I think we can
So
move
moving on to groundwater, so also known as aquifer recharge areas. Again, we wanted to include some language about education and have it be inclusive. And then we also added some protection of trees and vegetation in critical aquifer recharge areas. And then moving on to geologically hazardous areas and special flood hazard areas. We mostly updated just the terminology. So the geologically hazardous areas is the term that's in the Washington Administrative Code. And so we changed that to match, and that's also what it says in your critical areas code. And then we also just wanted to acknowledge that use of special flood hazard areas is actually in a different part of your code there in chapter 15 rather than 16. I think that's our main change there. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, and there was also some additional information or one added about notification so that everybody has access to that if there's an emergency. Excuse me. Can you scroll up just a little bit? All right, so that's good. Yeah. Keep going. And then again, these are more, to address flood storage, and then, because with the increased likelihood of additional flooding, want to be better prepared to address those 100-year floods that are coming a little bit more frequently. So it's some of this is surrounding notifications, but also some of it's more about stormwater conveyance and flood conveyance.
We have a question for you, Claire.
Yeah.
I just was wondering, what is the impact of Mud Mountain Dam when they released too much water? Is it in the northern area of the city?
Yeah, it's the White River.
Near Pacific?
Yeah, it's definitely the White River. I think we're capturing this here in these policies in terms of, you know, dealing with flood conveyance. Even references our White River Restoration Project really in certain terms. There are 170 acres of city-owned property. I mean, it's definitely catching all of that.
So the Mud Mountain Dam feeds the White River. Between that and surface water, you know, you're seeing the river fill up with sediment, which
Right.
is reducing our flood capacity, which
That's
is
why you have to do the bridge.
it's with the bridge. It's the 4 companion projects of the White River Restoration Project. So, but the impacts that we're seeing are really north of Tacoma Avenue. That's where it's more shallow.
Yeah, and these policies, I mean, they kind of lay out a, you know, partnering with and communicating with tribes and East Pierce Fire and Rescue and others as we're developing our flood hazard mitigation measures, which can be a variety of things, but our major one is the White River Restoration Project.
Shall I go on?
Yes, please.
And then we also just updated, so volcanic hazard areas is also a geologically hazardous area. And so we just, again, updated language around that. It's related to that. Keep going. And then fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. So those include streams is in this bucket as well. So we again just updated the terminology to use the state term, which is fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. Keep going. Yep, good. And then within that, we have incorporate climate resiliency strategies into city's urban forest management plan, particularly increase species diversity, native and climate resilient species. And then again, things related to forested hillsides and those environmental benefits. So environmental benefits such as slope stability, wildlife habitat, water filtration, attenuation. And then we have a section, air quality, greenhouse gases, and just a new policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and encourage something. Get scrolled down just one row. Sorry. Yeah, energy efficiency. Thank you. Again, we just updated these to be more in alignment with the state's recommendations about climate and energy conservation, energy efficiency.
I have a question for you, Claire.
Mm-hmm.
On 9.2.2, Councilmember Elfers, right now it says require street trees, on-site landscaping and all new developments. He would prefer the word promote street trees rather than require. Although he feels that most places would benefit from street trees. He would rather it not say require in the comp plan when it could say it in the code, which is easier to change in the future if we chose to do so.
And it actually does, if I could add, it does require that in our code, street trees and landscaping for all new developments. And of course, depending on the site constraints, each new development might be a little bit different. And there could be instances where a development on a corner may get street trees on one side, but not on the other side, just for reasons of infrastructure, site constraints and so on. So I don't, because this is a policy, if you're more comfortable with a different term like support or encourage, that works fine as a policy, but I just wanted you to know we do have the requirement over in the code.
I'm fine with supports or whatever, I mean, it's in the code, so. I'm just curious, and you don't need to answer it, the first question I thought is why do we plant street trees when we're tearing them up on the main street? Because we know it busts up the sidewalks, but that's just what I was wondering. I don't have street trees in front of my house, and I don't want them in front of my house, because I don't want them getting in my water line and stuff, but you know, it's just an opinion. It's not, you don't gotta say anything, but we're saying we're gonna tear them out on Main Street because it's ruining the sidewalks, and it's true. But we're gonna make people put them in the developments.
I will remind you that street trees in our city are the city's responsibility. So all the trees that are that are street trees,
Uh-huh.
the city is responsible for maintaining them.
In the new developments, who's responsible?
If it's in city right away, it's still city.
Yeah, and the new, I mean, if we, Pat has firsthand experience with this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. If you put the street tree in properly with root guards, it does a lot to prevent it from
And the right
damaging
type of
sidewalks.
tree.
And the type of tree as well. But definitely a love-hate relationship with street trees.
There is, because if my sidewalk buckles, I have to pay for that.
Unless it's a street tree, then we have to do it.
Well, this is gonna be fun. I'm looking at all the trees now.
It's been fun for
To be
30
fair, we
years.
have an inventory and that's how we base our sidewalk repair. And if it's a
Right.
street tree damage, to cities and we work to mitigate the risk and then it's on a replacement schedule. It takes, we're on a 10-year cycle right now to replace all the damaged sidewalks. It's the city's responsibility. And if your sidewalk is damaged not by a street tree, let's say it's in your property and it's caused the sidewalk damage, then it is on the homeowner to fix that, say, piece of sidewalk.
And I will add in the context of the environment and the requirements that the state has about us incorporating climate resiliency measures and policies. Street trees are a major way that the city can help reduce heat island effects, improve neighborhoods and so on. Because we don't have a private tree protection ordinance like a lot of cities do. We protect our street, we plant and maintain our street trees, protect them, and then we protect our trees in our parks where feasible. So street trees are a really important part, and that's why we have a Tree City USA
Pretty.
designation every year. So having a strong statement in here, I think would be good, but we can adjust that language.
Okay, it's already required, we know that. Do we want to change this language?
I don't care either way personally.
Anyone just feel, besides Andy, feels really strongly about a change? Okay, then we're gonna leave it as is.
As long as you don't make me plant trees in front of my house. I don't care. I've got them all in the backyard. It's all
Okay,
good.
Can I ask one more? Requiring the street trees, you still have to get, I mean, there's still a bunch of ordinances that say it
Oh,
can't be
yeah.
so close to
Yeah.
your
Yeah,
driveway,
yeah.
it can't be so close to the
Yeah.
stop sign, it's gotta be so far away from this and that.
Yeah,
So there's a
water
lot to it
meters
than
and all
just saying,
kinds of things.
you gotta put in 20.
Right.
Yeah, you might not be required to put one in, honestly, if it didn't meet
Depending on
some of the
where you're
separation
developing.
requirements.
She described it, maybe on this side, but not that side.
Yeah.
But I'm not on street
So-
tree duty.
Now, I know you were ready to move forward, but I will just offer one other thing. We could say, require street trees and on-site landscaping in all new developments as appropriate to the development.
Oh, that's
That
pretty
works.
nice.
I
Yeah,
like it.
That's smooth.
So that works, so there's a little wiggle room there.
Caveat will be heard.
Well, that does sound, you know, if I read that, I wouldn't be going crazy or anything.
It's okay, Pat.
Which is true in terms of how
Right, I guess
how
that's
you
what
actually
I'm trying to-
administer it.
That's good.
You like it? Greg, you like it?
No, I'm fine with that.
We like that. Okay, we can continue.
Right? Do I need to point out 9.3 also has require in it? We have to talk. Just can you scroll again, Stephanie? I also have this last one about streamlining process to allow, to establish regulation process to allow streamlining of permits for new energy technologies, and such as battery storage facilities, small, large scale solar, that sort of thing. And I think.
Okay, we have a question.
Yes.
So Andy's one comment here is he doesn't know that we need to list the types of new energy technologies because he's still not 100% sure that he supports battery storage facilities. And questions, why do we need to add them into the comp plan specifically?
Well, they're an example in this list, such as, I don't know. It's nice to have some examples so you can get your head around what we're talking about.
I see the point too. I just wanna.
I
throw it out.
agree. What do you guys think?
Since it's a reality of something that might be, we're hoping,
That's why
the
he's saying it.
developer's hoping to get it in your city, so I think I would keep the battery storage facilities. And
Yep.
I think even you have to look forward, what is out there in the next 10 years that we don't even know. When 10 years ago, I don't think anybody knew anything about a battery storage facility. So what, and I don't know, maybe some future technology development or something.
And
might
that's
be-
covered,
Yeah,
similar alternative technologies.
yeah.
Don't we already have regulations and processes to allow the streamlined permits? I mean, I don't understand the pushback. I'm trying to read the statement here. Establish regulations and processes to allow and streamline permits for new energy technologies. I mean, I would hope we'd
Okay.
be working on streamlining permits for anybody that wants to come into town, right?
Yeah,
Which
So
we
that's a
do.
given.
which we are.
So, this just talks about the stuff coming at us, which to your
Yeah.
point, we don't know what that is.
Yeah, but it does say new energy technology, so that would cover what we don't know.
And I, just to add, the reason that we're talking here about regulations and processes to streamline, a lot of these new technologies aren't defined in our codes and processes. So if somebody comes in for a battery energy storage system, or what's gonna be developed tomorrow, and our code probably doesn't address that, and we don't know, is it a
Yeah.
conditional use permit? Well, it's just like some other type of use that doesn't require a conditional use permit. So
You're just saying,
that's why
pull it in the
that's in
fold
there.
quickly, appropriately, let's get a process, let's get it defined so we
To
can.
help support
Yeah.
those technologies.
Got it. I'm fine with that,
Yeah,
how
they're
it stands.
I don't have a problem with it.
I think we're all okay with it. We can go on to the next one.
Okay. The next up is a bunch of maps. We did update the maps. We did, this is the stream and wetland map that you already saw. And then this one, I think has the same information on it, but it has, that one's updated as well. Aquifer recharge areas. And then this one as well, the same information that was in there before with the flood hazard areas. And then geologically hazardous areas, again, same thing, updated. And that's it, and we're on to climate.
I can cover climate briefly. Just pausing
Sorry,
for a
Stephanie, go
second.
ahead.
Okay. So background on the new climate change element is that there's a new state requirement created by House Bill 1181 for comprehensive plans to include a climate element. And that includes 2 sub-elements, the greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element and the climate resiliency sub-element. And in Sumner and in many other cities, we're opting to not create policies that are within that climate element, but to cross-reference policies elsewhere in the plan, because there's lots of policies in transportation, land use, environment, and elsewhere in the plan that relates to this topic. And so the climate change element is essentially an element with some background information and then some cross-references to the rest of the plan. And the adopted plan already has many relevant policies, so some of those are cross-referenced in the new climate element as well. You'll see some familiar topics from environment. And as I mentioned, these new and revised policies are included throughout the draft comp plan. They relate to topics like energy efficiency, walkability and bikeability, transit-oriented development, tree planting, sustainable industries and practices, recycled materials, water and air quality, low impact development, emergency preparedness, food access, cultural resources resiliency, economic resiliency, and wildfire prevention and flood resiliency. So as we go through all the elements as we've been doing tonight, you'll see examples of those throughout that have been included in elements of the plan. So just an example, there's an existing policy and community character that gets at pedestrian and bicycle friendly streets. So policies along those lines, we've identified as climate policies. There are some that we recommended revisions to, like this one in governance and permit process, around city government setting the example for compliance and innovation in its own operations, and adding some things beyond water and energy and sustainable building design, such as low impact development, noise and glare reduction, and accessibility. And then an example of a new policy in family and human services is around ensuring that parks and recreation facilities serve as refuges during extreme heat, cold, and smoke events. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, what kinds of edits are being made and what topics they relate to. And then just a quick look at the element itself. There's a little bit of introduction here on why there is an element. So the comp plan is required to have a climate change and resiliency element, these 2 sub-elements. The goals and policies are integrated throughout the comprehensive plan and cross-referenced here. Greenhouse gas emissions reduction. There's some information from Pierce County that identifies key sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So electricity, heating and cooling, transportation, solid waste and wastewater processing, natural gas and propane transport and use, industrial processes, land use, and tree loss. And so we have the policies identified throughout the plan that relate to greenhouse gas emissions reduction and some of the key topics that they relate to. And then similarly for resiliency, a little bit of background. There's some mapping that exists through the University of Washington on what climate impacts are to be expected throughout the state. And Pierce County and Sumner can expect increased precipitation, higher temperatures in the summer, more high fire danger days, and increased stream flows, which could increase the risk of heat waves, flooding, wildfires, impacting infrastructure, people, natural environment. And so these are policies embedded throughout the plan that relate to making the city more resilient to these impacts. And so they're cross-referenced here with a little bit of notes on the topics that they relate to. You'll see environment has many policies that relate. And that is the climate element.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Any questions?
So the last one is the historic and cultural resources. How are you all feeling?
It doesn't seem like it's very long,
It is not very long.
and I'd like to go ahead and proceed myself and get it.
Let's go for it.
All right.
Okay.
Stephanie,
Yes.
Stephanie, would you mind just going straight to the actual verbiage, the language?
Yeah.
And
I'm happy
skimming
to.
through that, but just highlighting the key policy changes.
Sure.
So if you're in the exhibit, it starts on page 89. If you're in the full packet, sorry, I need to get back to it. It starts on 122.
Thank you. So the introduction, there are a couple of edits and additions here. A little bit more language on the city of Sumner being located within traditional homelands of Coast Salish tribes, continuing to be a place of cultural importance. A little bit on the archaeological resources that have been found. There haven't been many, because there have not been many surveys. And a little bit of cleanup to the text in the introduction. There was some text previously on the National Register, which changes. So I think that was the background for that. And then the goals, policies, and objectives, a little bit of updated language on identifying, preserving, protecting, and enhancing areas of Sumner with historical, cultural, educational, or scientific values. Removing a policy about general survey being the process for which archaeological sites are identified. That's not typically how that's done. They're usually done as development is proposed. So this policy has been suggested removed. And then a policy on preserving, maintaining integrity of known resources, including listed properties. Developers should plan and design development, having those resources in a manner that prevents impacts to them and provides educational benefits to the public. And then a little bit of language change on 1.1.1. Removing a mandatory requirement to avoid impacts, since that's not always possible. So document how impacts were avoided or how avoidance is infeasible instead. Considering potential impacts of development on culturally significant tribal sites and collaborating with the tribes to ensure protection of those resources. And then request consultation with the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, known as DAP, for demolition or construction projects on sites located in town center with structures older than 45 years old or with structures identified by DAP as potentially eligible for listing. So this is requiring developers on sites that have these potentially eligible structures or old structures to consult with that department, but it's not requiring them to, I guess, mitigate exactly as the department recommends. It's just to consult and get some information on what their recommendations are. And you'll see that in the code as well. Require developers to stop work and notify the city, DAP, Puyallup Tribe, and Muckleshoot Tribe if any artifacts of possible value are uncovered during excavation. Requiring inadvertent human remains discovery language recommended by the state to be added to permits. Working with tribes, agencies, property owners to protect, enhance, restore ecosystems that could be impacted by climate change. And then some updates to 1.3, broadening kind of who it applies to, previously referred to the Sumner Historic Society, but now mentioning the Sumner Historical Society, Puyallup Historical Society, Japanese American Citizens Leagues, the tribes, other community groups. So just making that a little bit more broad. And then considering partnerships with historical preservation organizations. There's some policies that were kind of consolidated, essentially encouraging historical societies, others to provide access to documents, encouraging community programs for collecting and preserving oral histories, encouraging public awareness and understanding of prehistory and history of tribes in the area. There's a map from the Department of Ecology of tribal reservations and draft treaty ceded areas for context. Coordinating with residents, property owners to protect historic properties where feasible, that was added. Let's see. Some kind of just added text, just supplementing what's already there. And then encouraging the Historic Preservation Commission to develop a local register of historic places, and with permission from the tribes, a list of traditional cultural properties. There's a policy on nomination for listing that was consolidated above. There's some redundant text that's been removed. There's a policy that's been reworded about encouraging private property owners with eligible properties to voluntarily seek register listing. Sumner doesn't maintain their own program for that. It's a voluntary nomination. And then work with property owners and historic preservation societies to protect and adapt historic sites prone to floods, other climate events. And then under cultural arts, adding kind of some more inclusive language, so maintaining a cultural arts strategy that's reflective of Sumner's history and diverse communities. Partnering with community or volunteer organizations to promote cultural arts throughout the community, encouraging diverse range of cultural arts and events. Some rewording on goal 3 about recognizing downtown's historic meaning and the role of the historic downtown.
Okay, we have a question for you, Stephanie. Or I
Sure.
have a
I don't
question.
know if it's for her, but is there no longer gonna be a arts commission, cultural arts commission?
No, there still is.
Which policy are you looking at?
Oh, it's this one, I think.
2.3, I guess.
And the idea, I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
the idea here throughout this chapter was to try to make the names of organizations and commissions a little more generic.
Okay,
So you'll see things like, we added not just Sumner Historical Society, but organizations such as Sumner Historical Society, the Japanese American Organization, and so on. So that was the idea there. The point here is we are still wanting to promote cultural arts, but it may not be through the Arts Commission. And of course, the name was incorrect here in this policy.
I think that's it. We can continue.
Okay, under the goal around downtown's historic meaning, a policy around encouraging incorporation of street furniture and features along streets in the historic downtown that are compatible with historic character of the area. There's a policy proposed to be deleted around improving the Ryan House based on the city council decision last September.
And I just wanted to, Stephanie, if you can pause for a minute. So this is a key change in this element. So we're removing this language that was pretty much a mandate to improve the Ryan House and access. And what staff proposed and what the Planning Commission recommended in the end was 3.3, where it's a more generic approach. We're allowing and encouraging adaptive reuse of buildings. So it's not just the Ryan House. We have other buildings. Ryan House is special, of course, but we do have other buildings downtown that are historic in nature, that have a character that everyone loves. So this policy 3.3 was intended to capture, not exclude the Ryan House, but broaden that and capture other structures downtown that contribute to our historic character. So I just wanted to call that out for the council.
Thanks, Anne.
Anything else before we move on? Okay.
Okay, so that's the element. And then the code changes are fairly short. They're around projects involving demolition of a building or new construction on sites in town center where structures more than 45 years old or identified by the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation is potentially eligible to request a consultation with DAP to determine whether the property is considered a historic resource, and if it is, consider the mitigation measures recommended by DAP. So not required to implement them, but just to consider them. And so there's a process for that consultation request. And then another piece about requiring inadvertent human remains discovery language recommended by the state as a condition of project approval. So if ground disturbing activities encounter any kind of human remains, then that activity has to cease. And then there's a process that they follow to get the state to provide notice to proceed. So making sure that the appropriate steps are taken in that event. And then similarly, if any artifacts of possible historic, cultural, or archaeological value are uncovered during site work, work needs to immediately stop and notify the city, the state, the Puyallup tribe, and the Muckleshoot tribe. So an inspection would follow, an evaluation by a professional archaeologist or a professional historic preservation expert in coordination with the state and tribes. And that's all the code associated.
Thank you, Stephanie. Real quick, I'll just mention what Andy wrote here. I think they've done a great job of addressing it, but he had a concern over going back to the elements, sorry, the policies. The beginning, it talks about the, sorry, I'm going back up so I can speak intelligently about it here. The survey language in section 1 that was struck through. Stephanie did a good job of explaining why that survey language is no longer appropriate. And then overall, he just had some general concerns in section 1. There were several areas that use the word require. He prefers promote or encourage.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
Jason, are you referring to the code?
No.
And goal or the element?
The
I
elements.
assumed he was talking about the code, because that's where the word require.
Let's see.
In his, he was just looking at, I took his email to mean he was talking about.
Yeah, 1.1.4 required developers.
Yeah.
There's, yeah, 1.0.
No.
1.5.
Just turn it over to the council. I mean, if you have any concerns that pique your interest in policies.
We currently, just for council's information, we currently, on any project that requires SEPA, State Environmental Policy Act review, we require, we add conditions that say if you come across human remains, all the same language. If you come across artifacts, you stop work and consult with appropriate agencies and tribes. So we already require those things in terms of those two policies.
And that's not a city requirement, that's federal, state, yeah.
So I would think it should stay.
Yeah, it
and
totally makes
maybe you
sense.
can't really go back or make it less than.
I would tend to agree. I just wanted to express his opinions that he asked us to talk about today.
And I would also add our code reflects what you just saw in the policy about, that's why I was a little confused about which Mr. Elfers was talking about. But there is a reason for that word require in both the code and also in the
So it's not, you don't have the option to ignore.
we don't.
Those have been around a long time. I mean, like, long time, or it's code.
Years probably, I mean.
We see those on TV all the time, so sounds like we all agree with the language as written on 1.1.4.
1.1.5, 4 and 5.
4 and 5, okay, thank you. Is that correct? Okay,
That's clear, you've made it clear.
we like it as is.
You guys got through it. It's just more questions.
Any more questions for Stephanie?
Well, I guess my question is, I mean, we appreciate their giving us the input, but does the city hire them to work on the comp plan, the consultants? Is that?
They definitely don't do it for free.
No, I understand that, but that's a normal.
That's a good-
Yeah, it's very normal to use a consultant because this is a large body of work. Plus, they have the benefit of seeing multiple other jurisdictions' comp plans to help, get ideas and make it.
Yeah.
And
Doing
it
it
still
for
requires a lot of
years.
work by hand.
Yeah,
She's been working pretty much full-time on this comp plan amendment over the last year.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
Plus.
our consultants also help us out with some of the more technical modeling, and Burke in particular has also done state guidance on some of
Okay.
this stuff, so really the experts that we can lean on, that, like Jason said, they've worked with lots of other jurisdictions, even at the state level, so very helpful to have them.
Yeah, and these specialty, for example, Claire from Parametrics, she works with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, DNR, so when DFW is telling Sumner, you must do this.
Yeah.
Claire can work with us and be the go-between between us and WDFW and say, well, okay, this doesn't exactly work for Sumner, but we can show that it is best available science, which you're looking for. And likewise with our housing element, working with all those numbers, how do we figure out what we do with these housing units and how those are supposed to be allocated? We wouldn't have had the staff resources to do that here. So, yeah, and a lot of these big comp plan updates, most cities use consultants to help.
It just helps for me to understand or the context of, you know, how they work. And-
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, because I know it's a huge job and so how much longer do you have with the city? Is this your last?
Right.
63 hours and.
Oh my God.
Oh, my goodness.
That's not working out.
Just appreciate
So-
all you've done and
Oh, thank
the work
you.
you provided, you know, a lot of good guidance over the years, so.
Well, thank you, I appreciate your comments. I appreciate the council being patient. This is just so much material. It really is, so thanks for sticking it out and.
Well, I'm sure your
And
retirement will
all
be a
your
huge
thoughts.
loss for the city, but congratulations.
Well, thank you.
That's
Thanks
a
very
huge
much.
accomplishment for you.
Thanks
right?
very much.
Okay.
It'll be strange.
Yeah.
Only for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah, it doesn't take long.
It
Okay,
didn't
thank you,
take long.
Stephanie. I think we're good.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Stephanie.
you.
Okay, so we have two last, any agenda setting issues to discuss? Whether it's the council meeting agenda calendar or any committee meeting calendars? Nope.
CD
Wednesday.
committee's meeting tomorrow.
Tomorrow
Three.
at 3.
It's not tomorrow's Wednesday.
No, tomorrow.
But-
Community
Oh,
development,
CD.
yes.
Oh, wait, my hearing aid.
CD, community development.
Batteries died.
Oh, dear.
So I
Yeah,
think,
so just a reminder, 2 o'clock ribbon cutting, Main and Wood on Wednesday, followed by a budget special study session, 3 o'clock, right here.
okay,
And
Got it.
I went through that light today, it had a turn signal and boy, it's pretty
I went across
fancy.
it, but I didn't pay attention. So I adjourned the meeting, the special study session, at 8:56.
Thank you all, a lot of good work tonight.
Are we all?
Thank you, guys.